The grooming gangs are the worst scandal in British history, and they're still ongoing. And that's why it's imperative we need a national inquiry to uncover the scale of the state's complicity in the scandal and name, prosecute, deport, and, in an ideal world, give the death penalty to all of the perpetrators and collaborators. And the Labour government have launched the 3 locations for their limited statutory inquiries, and they are London, Bradford, and Keighley, and Oldham. Bradford was chosen because of the advocacy work of Conservative MP for the region, Robbie Moore. London was chosen, according to the inquiry team, because it has the highest rate of referrals for child abuse offences in the country, and there's of course a rape reported every 52 minutes in London. Despite this, Mayor Sadiq Khan, who just received a peerage from outgoing Prime Minister Keir Starmer, plays dumb as to what the nature of a grooming gang is when his rivals in City Hall bring them up. But the problems with the inquiry are numerous. First, it's headed by Labour Baroness Anne Longfield, who was the Children's Commissioner, who celebrated the 2012 report and tried to hire its author, Sue Berylowitz, which blamed white men for these crimes, and despite a disproportionate overrepresentation in per capita statistics of Pakistani perpetrators, dismissed the idea that there was a racial or religious motivation to these crimes. She tried to hire Berylowitz on a £960 a day consultancy rate after giving her over £100,000 in taxpayers' money in severance pay from the position. And we also know that this is happening across the country. Charlie Peters of GB News, who's produced this article, found that it's happening in over 50 towns and cities all across Britain. And one new conviction has just occurred of a former Labour candidate jailed for grooming offences. He and his 2 brothers have been convicted of grooming gang offences in Sheffield. Ammar, Kamar, and Kamran Ilyas were convicted of child abuse offences against 5 victims. He was known as Killer to his victims, and he's used a gun and threats of gang rape to coerce young girls into abuse. Ammar was meant to be jailed alongside his younger brothers Kamran and Kamar, but he absconded before his trial last year and is still in Pakistan. Now, I am glad he's not in this country anymore to perpetrate such abuses, but why was he here in the first place? Ammar was found guilty of 20 offences. The judge described Ammar as a determined and predatory offender, as he sentenced him to 27 years, plus 1 year, on an extended licence. The judge sentenced him consecutively for one particularly brutal rape, which he said demanded the punishment. He was said to have humiliated one victim in front of her friends after the rape. Another victim, who Ammar knew had vulnerabilities, was secluded and threatened with having to perform a sex act on all of the men if she didn't comply. She must have been terrified, said the judge. Ammar was also found guilty of raping a 13-year-old girl when she was asleep at a friend's house, and another one of Ammar's victims was procured for him by his brother Kamran. Some of the girls were white, others were from the Pakistani community, and they used the Izzat, honour and shame culture to try to pressure the girls into silence. Fortunately, the girls spoke out against the brothers, provided witness testimony, and got them convicted. Despite all this, Ammar Ilyas became a Labour Party candidate and a youth worker. He ran unsuccessfully for Labour in the City Ward of Sheffield City Council in the 2016 election. In 2019, Ilyas, working as a taxi driver, was stabbed in the head by drug dealer Basan Khan, who was later jailed for the attack. So we know that there is a trafficking, drug, and sexual abuse network operating all across Britain, with the nodes in that network being towns with prominent Pakistani populations, and Sheffield, a long-time Labour stronghold, is one of them. Ilyas was supported by activists from the Corbyn-backing Momentum group after the stabbing, who described him as a wonderful comrade in a fundraiser, and he was working as an anti-knife crime campaigner for charity Mums United. Of course, Mums United, the Labour Party, and Momentum weren't aware of Ammar's crimes. But these are the kinds of behaviours that occur when you welcome this population into your country. You encourage it, you foster it, you allow access to your political system, you allow it the ability to establish businesses in this country they can then use to traffic and abuse our children. They shouldn't be here. But getting them removed has proven tricky because the government is refusing to use all of the diplomatic leverage at its disposal to remove these perpetrators, and it also refuses to stop importing them in the first place because we still take in tens of thousands of Pakistanis every single year, and of course the sitting Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood is a Pakistani Muslim woman, so she wouldn't dare do anything that disadvantages her ethnic and religious in-group and her home country. And the most egregious example is Shabir Ahmed, who was the ringleader of a Rochdale rape gang, despite there being, according to the victims of this disgusting individual, hundreds of customers. So there are just Pakistani child predators walking about completely free in our country, including this guy, who has just been released early from his sentence. He was jailed for 22 years in August of 2012, but was released on licence in early July. He was a British and Pakistani dual national, but upon conviction he renounced his Pakistani citizenship. And for some reason we allowed him to do that. And now Pakistan is refusing to take him back. So Shabana Mahmood apparently wants to change the law, make an amendment to the 1971 Immigration Act, which currently stops Shabir Ahmed from being deported from the UK, in order to deport him. The problem is, Pakistan is refusing to take him back. So according to the Pakistani government, they have told the Telegraph, Pakistan has maintained that someone who is not a Pakistani national cannot be allowed or accepted inside the country. Ahmed is considered a serious safeguarding risk because of his criminal past in the UK. How can someone with his criminality be deemed safe in a country like Pakistan? He poses as much danger to children in Pakistan as he would anywhere else. That's not true, but we'll get to that in a moment. Will the UK allow it if Pakistan sends a foreign criminal to live in the UK communities? Shabir Ahmed is a foreigner. No, he's one of yours. He is Pakistani by heritage. And you know that because you have a significant Pakistani diaspora, which you accept remittances from and use as diplomatic leverage to try to encourage our domestic countries to build airports in Mirpur, or accept more Pakistani visitor and worker and family reunification visas. You use Pakistani heritage politicians in Britain as leverage to advantage your country. So you know this is a Pakistani man, you're just playing dumb because you don't want to take one of your rapists back, because you tend to produce a disproportionate amount of them. A second official, who has been in talks with the UK government about Ahmed, said that he moved to Britain when he was a boy and had spent nearly 95% of his life in the UK. He said, it's for the UK government to decide his future. He's not a Pakistani national. As far as we know, he revoked his Pakistani citizenship, and Pakistan will never allow him inside the country. A British government spokesperson said it was doing everything possible to deport foreign offenders such as Ahmed, but admitted this necessarily involves the agreement of the receiving country, which has not always been possible. A source said all options remained on the table to put pressure on Pakistan, including the possibility of imposing visa restrictions on its citizens seeking to come to Britain. However, it's understood this is the nuclear option that would only be considered if all other diplomatic efforts have failed. They have. They shouldn't be here in the first place. You shouldn't be importing them. There is not one single person who could provide a benefit to Britain from Pakistan that is worth risking importing the rape gangs for. And we know that they're not going to do everything within their power, because during this dispute, the Labour government has just given £153 million in foreign aid to Pakistan. So rather than withholding it, or just refusing to give it because they keep producing rapists and they refuse to take them back, we've just given them hundreds of millions in taxpayers' cash as a reward for what they've done to our country. To add insult to injury, the Foreign Office said the aid will help forge a safer, more resilient Pakistan and would help limit security and migration risks to the UK. No, it's just going to encourage more of them to come over because we look like a soft touch. And I don't care about safer, more resilient Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan is horrible because of the culture and the behaviour that its people practice. The squalid conditions of Pakistan are a direct consequence of what Pakistanis do, and so I'm not interested in helping them out, especially not at the expense of me and my children. Especially when Pakistani politicians are blaming Britain for this. Tahir Andrabi, Pakistan's Foreign Office spokesman, pointed the finger at the UK for Shabir Ahmed's crimes because he, quote, grew up, was raised, groomed, and unfortunately spoiled in Britain. He said the onus was exclusively on Britain, declaring publicly for the first time that Pakistan would not be taking back Ahmed despite him being born there. Quote, his heinous crimes demand serious introspection rather than a quest to search for extraneous causes. The extraneous causes are that he is a Pakistani Muslim man, and this is what Pakistani Muslim men do disproportionately, both in Pakistan and in Britain, so they shouldn't be here. So the only introspection required on our part is to figure out why we let him in the first place, who decided that, how to punish them, and how to get rid of every single Pakistani perpetrator in our country. One such guilty person is Sajid Javid. Yes, responsibility is not confined to the Labour Party for covering up for these criminals. Sajid Javid, himself a Pakistani man born in Rochdale, decided against pursuing the deportation of Ahmed and his co-conspirators. Shabir Ahmed, Qari Abdul Rauf, Abdul Aziz, and Adil Khan were among 9 men convicted in 2012 of a catalogue of serious offences against vulnerable children in Rochdale. As the only groomers to have dual UK-Pakistani citizenship, they were at risk of being deported back to Pakistan, but none of the 4 eligible were deported, or were facing deportation. And even Labour opposition politicians were questioning Sajid Javid at the time as to why he wasn't willing to do this. And if you're wondering why they're not willing to do it now, it's because his brother, Pakistani man, Baz Javid, is running immigration over at the Home Office. He's the Director General of Immigration Enforcement. During this dispute, Shabir Ahmed was the only one still in prison. Abdul Rauf was living at his home address in Rochdale, and Abdul Aziz was seen in the town. Khan's exact whereabouts were unknown. One woman, who was abused, wet herself and ran into a shop after she spotted one of her attackers in the town centre, according to locals, and another victim bumped into her abuser in a nightclub. Why are we subjecting our women and girls to this danger? And we know the Pakistani government are lying, because during the trial in Liverpool Crown Court in May 2012, Ahmed interrupted the proceedings by taking off his shirt, ripping out his chest hair, and saying the charges were all white lies. He accused the courts, the police, the media and the government of conspiracy against Muslims. He delivered the following rant, quote, "We are a civilized society. We are the supreme race, not these white bastards. You will not get a CBE, you will not get an MBE, you will get a DM, a destroyer of Muslims. You were born 1,000 years too late. You fucked my community, you destroyed my community and our children. None of us did that. White people trained those girls to be so much advanced in sex. They were coming, without hesitation, to Rochdale, Oldham, Bradford, Leeds and Nelson and wherever." Note that he names a bunch of towns that have never been examined in an inquiry. He said the jury was taking instructions from BNP leader Nick Griffin, and he pointed to prosecutor Rachel Smith and said, "I curse you at night, I curse your family. You will understand," pointing at the judge, "I curse the juries, I curse the media and most of you bastards. Your family will get it. You have destroyed our community. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Maggie Thatcher, they're all the same. They're all on the take. They, looking at the police, are on the take. It's true. They're all bent bastards. It has to be taken by average people like you and I. They take all the money and we take all the weight. These," the police officers, "were pissed on by Theresa May you be more pissed on." He denied all his charges because they never admit guilt, and then smiled when he was sentenced. I included all of this in my supplementary materials to Rupert Lowe's Rape Gang Inquiry. This Substack post contains the materials for a report that I produced for the Rape Gang Inquiry. I wasn't paid for doing so, I just wanted to contribute to this fact-finding mission. There is a PDF version available to download if you find it easier to read, or the full report is available to read and listen to on my Substack. I contributed an hour of testimony to the hearings, explaining my reporting on the topic, and providing research on the previous reports on the demographics of perpetrators and victims, on previous cases, the racial and religious motivations of the rape gangs. But because much of it didn't make it into the final report, I thought I would make this supplementary video just to add onto the Rape Gang Inquiry report, go through it in comprehensive depth, and then address some of the criticisms of the report and try to build on the research that the lads over at Restore Britain have done. I'll be sure to link this at the top of the description of wherever you're watching this so you can use it as a resource. All of the footnote references are available at the bottom of the article. Despite a total dearth of mainstream media coverage, save a few podcasts, Patrick Christis on GB News and Sky News Australia, hundreds of thousands of people have read the Rape Gang Inquiry report. Rupert Lowe went on Joe Rogan's podcast a couple of weeks ago to explain its contents, and I thought we would do a comprehensive summary of the new findings and some of the more questionable or scrutinised elements of the report to give a comprehensive and even-handed overview. With any contentious topic like this, of course, it's always difficult to address when there are criticisms of a report, but it is worth going over them for the sake of transparency, truth, and trying our best to shine a light on, again, the worst scandal which is still going on in our nation's history. Following Rupert Lowe's eloquent forward, laying accurately the blame for the rape gangs at the foot of post-war migration and the mentality that if Britain has borders and a strong national identity, then somehow we'll morph ineluctably into Adolf Hitler, and so we have to subject our children to all sorts of optional, unspeakable atrocities perpetrated by men who never needed to be here from culturally incompatible lands, so that we don't do a racism. There were a couple of quotes from Nietzsche and Albert Einstein. There is an accusation that the Einstein quote is misattributed. I think these shouldn't have been included because they seem jarring for the subject matter, but that's a small gripe to have. In future, given there are political motivations to dismiss the findings of this report, everything should be about as above reproach as possible, and I don't think these were necessary. The crimes are summarised on pages 7 to 8, as the inquiry heard harrowing testimony from survivors and their families. The method used to groom children typically followed the same process. Girls as young as 11 were initially befriended by a young Muslim man who then treated the young child like an adult and would then start providing them with alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes. After a few months, the girls would then be collected from school gates, care homes, and streets in taxis. They were taken to houses, flats, restaurants, and hotels where they were raped repeatedly by groups of men, tortured, filmed for blackmail, and told they were white trash or kafar who merited punishment. Many became pregnant while still children, some miscarried under trauma, others endured coerced abortions, and some gave birth to children who were later removed by the state. We found the same unspeakable crimes occurred in at least 149 local authority districts. Survivors described daily rapes, red rooms of extreme torture, trafficking between cities, and institutional disbelief that compounded their suffering. Some girls were even trafficked to the Middle East, where they would endure Islamic marriage. One survivor details being abused by objects, Coca-Cola bottles, keys for some reason. Someone tried to put a baseball bat there. And the panelist asked, do you think they're doing these for gratification? And she said, it's about harm. They don't care about you. They usually try doing these things after they've done the sexual bit that they wanted to do. Once they finish, that's it. They do what they want to you, that's how it seemed. One recalls how she was beaten black and blue and raped, not only sexually, but with objects. There was an incident where she was taken to hospital. It's not even in her medical records. She was taken to A&E because her vagina was split from a glass bottle. How can you sleep at night knowing this has happened to a child on your watch and you decide not to report it? And you just send them off for the abuse to be perpetrated again? It's unfathomable to me. The testimonies are harrowing, and we'll go through some as some case studies. Many of them are euphemized. There's Chloe. Chloe was abused by her stepfather, which was enabled by her mother. She was then abused by her uncle. She became addicted to cigarettes, alcohol, cannabis that he plied her with from age 10. She was then groomed by Pakistani and Indian men in the town who worked in the taxi trade. She was raped, took two abusers to court, but neither were convicted. On one occasion, Chloe was abducted by her abuser who was driving drunk and taken to a graveyard. He gave Chloe, still 12 years old, whiskey before forcing himself on her and abusing her. He withdrew before finishing and forced the empty bottle into Chloe where it shattered. Chloe then admitted herself to A&E, but no questions were asked how she had sustained such an injury. She was examined, the glass was removed, and she was discharged. Social workers then ignored her report of abuse about her mother and stepfather. Adults were indifferent to the subcontinental paedophiles picking Chloe up and her friends from the town centre when she was 10. She was placed in foster care, but the home didn't monitor her disappearances. At age 13, Chloe disclosed to social services she was being abused by gangs of Muslim men. In response, social services did not intervene, but rather talked to Chloe about contraception and sexual health. So they promoted her doing it in a way that wouldn't incur uncomfortable consequences for them and the abusers. One social worker regularly started taking Chloe to a sexual health clinic where she was diagnosed with chlamydia in her throat and vagina, gonorrhea, genital warts, and pelvic inflammatory disease. Neither the social worker nor the clinic staff questioned or reported this. The police were aware of Chloe's activities, but instead of targeting those responsible for her abuse, they routinely failed to question them, let alone pursue further action when Chloe was found in cars and houses with them. The first time she was taken into the sexual health clinic by a social worker, she walked her in there and it turned out she had chlamydia in her throat and in her nether regions, and gonorrhea. At the time, they diagnosed her with genital warts, and a few months later, she was taken back again. She was diagnosed with chlamydia again, gonorrhea again, but this time it was a pelvic inflammatory disease. Never once did any nurse or doctor question that. One social worker actually suggested that her abuse allowed her to convincingly play a child who had been prostituted on Emmerdale and suggested that she go into acting. She then ran away and was trafficked by a Muslim gang for 6 months. When the police found her, she was in a car with a South Asian Muslim man. The man was let go without charge and she was returned to her mother's house. After gaining some stability, going to college, training as a hairdresser, she re-established contact with a friend who had also been abused. When she came to Chloe's house, she brought a gang of Muslim men with her who vandalised the house and assaulted Chloe. She then lost her job and turned back to drink and drugs. The gang used the house to abuse her and other children. When she called the police, they threatened to arrest her instead of the men because it was happening at her home. She was then trafficked, given heroin, and eventually attempted suicide. She discovered she was pregnant with a child fathered through abuse by a Pakistani illegal immigrant. He moved into her home, and she was forcibly converted to Islam. She was made to marry her rapist, wear a hijab, and was beaten frequently. Her daughter was born with multiple health complications. She sought help from Women's Aid after a friend of hers was also abused by a gang of Muslim men and relocated to Scotland with her daughter. Chloe personally knows at least 20 other girls from her area who were predated on by the Muslim gangs who abused her. The pattern was always the same: grooming, drugging, trafficking, abuse, and rape. Furthermore, Chloe describes being taken into mosques where imams would describe non-Muslims as infidels and preach that white women who dressed inappropriately were free game. Chloe believes the local police, social services, NHS, and government were all fully aware of what was happening, including the racialized nature of the crimes, but they didn't intervene for two reasons: because they couldn't be bothered with the paperwork, and because they didn't want to be seen as racist. Chloe blames these bodies and their major push for diversity for her abuse. She says, "If I can just save one more child, girl or boy, from going through any of this, then I've done my job." Which is why she told her story to the inquiry. Her story is common across multiple victims. Fiona, who worked with Adam Wren and Open Justice to tell her story in a series of podcasts, she told the inquiry that staff at the care home where she was being pimped out to Pakistani rapists avoided proper investigation for fear of being called racist. When Fiona's mother called the police to report her daughter missing and mentioned a history of abuse by Asian men, the call handler told her, "You can't describe them as Asian men because that's racist. You should just be glad your child is being taught a different culture." On one occasion, a police officer returned Fiona to the house where the abuse was occurring and told the men to have fun with her. On another occasion, police instructed the abusers they could persuade Fiona to sign herself out of care, and the police would then stop bothering them. The gang then tried to convince her to do so, intending to traffic her to Kashmir, and she only wasn't eligible to be sent overseas because she didn't have a passport. Between 2008 and 2012, she was repeatedly raped by multiple men connected to an organised grooming network. She was often kept in a house known as a party house where between 10 and 20 men would attend at one time. On one occasion, she was encouraged to bring her friends because the owner had relatives visiting from Birmingham to celebrate Eid and expected girls to be there. Within the house, the girls were routinely referred to as white slags, while the men wanted Pakistani girls to be kept pure for marriage. The gangs also feared the English Defence League would arrive armed, so they kept baseball bats for protection, and they also allegedly spoke of attending EDL demonstrations with weapons. This inter-ethnic violence is caused by the presence of these Pakistani clans preying on children in the first place. If they weren't here, then you wouldn't have the far right, in as far as it even exists, because the EDL weren't actually far right. You wouldn't have them here in the first place. Fiona was then drugged and abused repeatedly by an illegal Pakistani immigrant and impregnated in a mixed-sex care home when she was 15. Her son was given up for adoption. Michelle was abused by a pack of Pakistani brothers and their friends, one of whom accompanied her to the station to give a statement after Michelle's mother called the police, and the police accepted him as her appropriate adult and then dropped the case. Care staff would call the police, but officers reportedly referred to the girls as prostitutes, despite them being children, and so didn't act. Michelle was raped in bin sheds, threatened with a knife, and forced into sex with multiple men waiting in cars. She was drugged, beaten, burned with cigarettes, locked in rooms, and passed between men. An amusement arcade was used as a front for drug dealing and the sexual exploitation of children. She became pregnant 4 times as a result of rape, leading to miscarriages, 1 abortion, and 1 surviving child. Of her abusers, she states 98% of them were Pakistani Muslim. If not, they were Iraqi, Muslim, or Kurdish. She now lives with severe PTSD and lifelong trauma, describing both her childhood and her future as destroyed. Sally is a name that won't be familiar to people, but when you read her story, you realise she's the mother of Eleanor Williams. This is the girl who was platformed by the media as proof that the grooming gangs are a hoax because she misidentified some of her perpetrators and fabricated some injuries to alert the police to the fact that she was actually being abused, as it turns out, by perpetrators who have now been jailed, who were named in her diary, who the police knew about at the time during her trial and did not release the names of to the public when the media were pretending that she was purely a perpetrator of hoax. And she did misidentify some men publicly, and it caused their lives to be ruined, so that shouldn't be excused. But she was actually abused by a Muslim grooming gang. She sent some of them to prison. And Sally spoke to the inquiry. On one occasion, Sally's daughter was invited to a party. She received a call later that evening from one of her daughter's friends saying her daughter was lying on the pavement outside the property. If Sally couldn't pick her up, they were going to take her to the bus stop and leave her there as she was making too much noise. When her mother found her lying on the ground, she was making a horrendous wailing sound and kept saying not to touch her. Her mother recognised something was seriously wrong and took her to the hospital. Her daughter told the nurse carrying out the examination she had been sexually assaulted. The hospital notes recorded that her genitalia was swollen and red. The hospital reported the incident to the police. Sally's daughter then received threats via Snapchat, became scared about the outcome of the case, and withdrew from the process. Around the same time, social services closed their case on the family. Sally believes her daughter did not want to invite more trouble into the household. It later emerged in court they'd all been smoking cannabis. Sally believes her daughter had participated and that something had happened to her, but she was found guilty of lying about being raped. Sally began to notice that her daughter's phone would ring regularly, with Asian men's names appearing on the screen. When she asked about them, her daughter tried to hide the calls. The bar manager that her daughter was working at stopped her daughter from working on the main floor because she was small and they struggled to keep track of her. They also ensured she was always paired with an older member of staff, as the Asian men would harass her if she was working alone. One Asian man gifted her a gold chain. Sally's daughter began saying she wanted to move away from the house. She had regularly travelled to a nearby town by train. Sally would pick her up and drop her off at the station, and she never appeared to have been drinking or using drugs. One day, Sally returned home to find her daughter had left with her possessions, was ignoring her calls. She told work colleagues she had moved because her stepfather was harming her, but that wasn't true. After days of investigation, Sally managed to find where her daughter had moved to. When she arrived at the flat, she found her daughter with 2 police officers to whom she was reporting an allegation of rape. When her daughter handed in her phone as evidence, the police found hundreds of messages from Asian men. They believed she was being groomed. She was later found guilty of lying about the rape she had reported. Another incident involved a different Asian man who refused to leave Sally's daughter in a flat. Police told him to leave, but asked no questions. He left behind a balaclava, yet the police showed no interest despite him carrying it while visiting a young woman. After her flat door was kicked down in yet another incident while she was missing, she returned to her mother's home. She later explained she'd moved away to keep the family safe. She later claimed she'd been told that if she did not do as her abusers said, they would harm her brother, rape her sister, and firebomb the house. She'd lied to her colleagues about her stepdad to avoid bringing repercussions on the family. She then went missing again. The police stated they believed she was making the whole thing up and injuring herself, so they charged her with perverting the course of justice. Part of her bail conditions required her not to leave Sally's house. The following week, she attempted suicide by overdose. She went missing one final time, was found in a field with injuries to her head and ear, a severed finger, and numerous cuts and bruises. Following this, she wrote a Facebook post alleging she had been the victim of grooming gangs. The post went viral. Within an hour, the police arrested her and she was sent to prison. Following her daughter's conviction, the family experienced sustained harassment and intimidation, particularly from one Muslim man. This is despite now 3 perpetrators that Eleanor had named going to prison. A girl called Anna was coerced into performing oral sex, age 13, on an 18-year-old. It was filmed and circulated via Snapchat, and she became a social pariah. And because of this, she was vulnerable to being preyed upon by 3 Muslim brothers who intoxicated and abused her. During the trial, the perpetrators used the time to spread rumours portraying the abuse as consensual and to boast about the assaults. In the courtroom, the abuse and intimidation continued. They pulled faces, pointed and laughed at her, made rude remarks about her appearance. The behaviour wasn't addressed by the court. One of the brothers was convicted of sexual assault, and as he was taken into custody, he shouted, "Allahu Akbar." At the sentencing, the brother's sister shouted abuse at Anna, threatened her, and later breached her anonymity online. She blamed the jury, stating they were all white. She was eventually arrested and charged with malicious communications. This might be the same sister of the abuser who conducted a TikTok live stream with her brother using a smuggled phone while he was in prison. Jane was abandoned by her mother and beaten by her father. Her mother returned when she was 13 with a boyfriend who abused her and a drug dealer who also abused her. The drug dealer would pick Jane up from school, but teachers didn't care, and would force her out of school and to his car. He would give her drugs and abuse her regularly. The police told Jane she would have to testify alone against him, so she withdrew her report. After a suicide attempt at school, she was dismissed by her father and teachers as seeking attention. She tried again in hospital to cut her own throat. She was then homeless, taken into foster care. A friend in the accommodation invited her to a party where 6 or 7 Somali men stripped, shaved, and abused her, intending to sell her into sex slavery. Accommodation staff accused the other girls of making it up. She was then sectioned, but when she told her story to police, she was not believed. She developed an eating disorder to thwart her captor's attempts to make her gain weight, and as a result developed endometriosis and lost half her uterus. So she seems incapable of having children as a result of all the abuse she suffered. Leanne was abused by Iraqi, Kurdish, and other Muslim men from age 14 in Sheffield, the same location where those 3 brothers that I began this show with were just prosecuted. She was exposed to shootings and stabbings by the gangs and was impregnated and miscarried. Despite this, the police and NHS expressed no concerns. Lily was raised in a large, loving, working-class family home in the 1970s. Her sister was abused by her own social worker at age 12. This was actively covered up by management, who pretended he was in a relationship with another social worker to deflect suspicion. He gained legal guardianship of Lily's sister and eventually married her. He was paid by the local authority, and her sister never completed her education. Lily witnessed children being selected by staff and handed over to foreign taxi drivers over many years. In the children's home, Lily was violently assaulted and sexually abused by staff. Later in adulthood, she was diagnosed with a severe brain aneurysm as a result of all the abuse. Another Eleanor, likely pseudonymous, saw her parents divorce and her behaviour deteriorated. She was then expelled from school. She was groomed At 13, by both white and Muslim predators who drugged her, she was frequently arrested, but the police failed to protect her. Her mother did not report her missing. When she returned home, she found her mother had left the house without her. Social services told her to travel to her father's home alone. In a majority ethnic minority area, she was explicitly told by one school she could not be admitted because she was an English girl and would be the only one. This is not a fate we should be inflicting on our children, but this is going to be the reality very soon as our children become a minority in their own generation by 2031, and schools across Britain are reaching the demographic tipping point where white British children, are less than 50% of all pupils. She ran away again, was arrested repeatedly, and was eventually given a spiked drink by a group of Muslim men. When she woke up, she was aware she was inside a house that appeared to be decorated for an Asian wedding but lost consciousness. When she awoke properly, she found herself abandoned by the side of the road, unclothed, injured and disoriented. She managed to make it back to her children's home. However, she wasn't asked what had happened, taken to hospital, or had any record made of the incident in her case files. She was then homeless, before being allocated to a care home. When a drug dealer trafficked her to Jersey for a few days, the care home didn't alert the authorities or questioned where she'd been when she'd returned. She was later arrested for grievous bodily harm when the gang that was abusing her stabbed someone else, and she stayed at the scene to provide first aid. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and she converted to Islam while inside to survive. Before serving her sentence, she became pregnant by an older man and entered into an Islamic marriage with him, believing it might provide stability and protection. She was imprisoned with her young baby, an experience she found deeply distressing. She then met and remarried another man who took her to Saudi Arabia. After leaving him with her children, she returned to Britain where she was abused and impregnated again. At no point did the police or social services try to help her. The executive summary makes a series of assertions about the number of victims and the composition of the groups of perpetrators. The scale of the crimes committed is staggering. It has previously been established that, at the very least, 250,000 young white girls have been subjected to repeated rape, gang rape, trafficking, torture, pregnancy, forced Islamic conversion, and lifelong trauma. The true number is probably higher. The perpetrators bear primary responsibility, yet the institutional failures that enabled them for decades must also be confronted. In court records and official inquiries, around 87% of those convicted in these group-based child exploitation cases bore distinctively Muslim names. The vast majority of men involved in these gangs were not convicted. Dr. Taj Hargay, an imam with the Oxford Islamic congregation, believes the true proportion of gang members who are Muslims to be around 95%. This figure far exceeds the Muslim share of the overall UK population. The overwhelming majority of the rape gang networks consisted entirely of men from Muslim backgrounds, predominantly of Pakistani heritage, although smaller groups from Somali, Iranian, Syrian, Turkish and other Muslim origins were also involved. We know now, of course, there is an Afghan rape gang comprised of illegal migrants in Norfolk, and we know from Dame Louise Casey's audit in summer of last year that illegal migrants are using social media and existing clan and religious networks to come over to Britain on the promise from people smugglers that Britain is essentially a brothel full of white women, and then to ingratiate themselves in established grooming and rape trafficking networks. This is expounded upon on page 114, where the report says, analysis of 264 convictions for group-based child sexual exploitation from 2005 to 2017 found that 84%, 222 offenders, were South Asian, with the vast majority Pakistani Muslim. Only 7% were white and 8% were black. Additional context from expert commentary includes statements by Dr. Taj Hargay, who observed that virtually every individual in these grooming gangs appear to be Muslim, estimating that 95% of those involved are of the Islamic faith. As previously repeated, Peter McLaughlin's research in the book Easy Meat indicates that approximately 87% of rape gang convictions were of people with distinctively Muslim names. These figures stand in marked contrast to the much smaller proportion of Pakistani or Muslim communities within the overall population of modern Britain. Muslims approximately 6.5% and Pakistanis around 2.1%, according to the most recent census data. Multiple examinations, including police data from various forces, national audits, and independent reviews, have documented this overrepresentation in group-based offending of this nature, even as some earlier official narratives emphasized no single community profile or sought to downplay ethnic patterns. This tracks with my reporting on the Freedom of Information Access requests that were procured from West Yorkshire Police and reported when I was still working with Courage Media in May 2025. It found that across its 5 districts, Bradford, Calderdale, Kirklees, Leeds and Wakefield, which is being targeted in the localised statutory-backed inquiries, Asian Pakistani suspects were 21.48% of all suspects, with a rate of 507.7 suspects per 100,000 people in West Yorkshire. Bangladeshis had a lower rate of 0.89% and a rate of 408.3 per 100,000. Other Arab, Middle Eastern, Latin American, etc. suspects were 0.96%, but had the highest per capita rate at 530 suspects per 100,000. This is despite those identifying as Asian or Asian British making up only 16% of the population across West Yorkshire's districts and 10% of the overall population in England, according to now outdated 2021 census data, which is the reason we need an emergency census. White Britons were underrepresented at 44.54% of suspects, despite being 74.4% of the population of England and Wales. Unfortunately, West Yorkshire doesn't provide a breakdown of the total white British population by ethnicity, except for in Bradford district when they were 56.7% of the population, according to the 2021 census. White British suspects had the lowest per capita offending rate of 155.3 per 100,000. Black, African and Caribbean suspects were 1.83% of all suspects, but had the third highest per capita offending rate of 459.1 per 100,000. So overwhelmingly, the data in just this small snapshot of West Yorkshire shows that non-whites are disproportionately overrepresented in child abuse offences, especially group-based child abuse offences, and white Brits are disproportionately underrepresented. In total, non-white British suspects accounted for 55.46% of all suspects, despite making up only 26% of the national population. This yields an offending rate twice that of their white British counterparts, and additionally 6.4% of suspects had their ethnicity marked as not stated, and 13% of suspects as not recorded. That's almost a fifth of all suspects. So that takes the maximum potential share of Asian offenders to 42.73%, a rate 2 to 4 times their share of the national population. Among victims, white British children counted for 55.6%, making up the largest ethnic group in absolute terms. They were outnumbered on a per capita basis by black, African and other black victims, who were 0.88%, but had a per capita rate of 1,260 per 100,000. Those of mixed ethnic backgrounds comprised 1.75%, with a per capita rate of 425.4% per 100,000. Despite being the largest ethnic group among perpetrators, Asian Pakistanis only comprised 2.96% of victims at a per capita rate of 90.6 per 100,000 people. So the data demonstrates that abuse is happening between ethnic groups, largely non-white against white, rather than exclusively white against white, non-white against non-white, or white against non-white. However, the Rape Gang report did omit some of the previous research into perpetrator demographics, which I included in my submission. In 2013, the National Crime Agency's Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command found 75% of Type 1 group-based child exploitation offenders were Asian. Type 1 offenders were defined as, the focus appears to be on the abuse of teenagers and young adults on the basis of their vulnerability rather than as a result of a specific preferential interest in children. Members of the offending group can be linked to one another in a number of ways. Many have loose associations, others present as more formal networks or organised groups with criminal or business ties rather than friendship. The abuse is carried out by more than one perpetrator and can involve individual or multiple victims. CEOP assesses that Type 1 offenders are unlikely to identify themselves as having a prurient interest in children, but they still abuse children because they're vulnerable to exploitation. So this is the kind of abuse that is perpetrated by the taxi firms run by Pakistanis who would drive up outside of care homes, bib their horn, and then the state-employed care workers would traffic the children straight to the doorstep of the care home to be driven away by their abusers. They know that these children are from broken homes, they're neglected, they're in state institutional care, they're vulnerable to grooming and manipulation, drink and drug addiction, and so they prey on them purposefully because they're the children that our civilization seems to have forgotten about, that doesn't care about. They are the children that are treated like prostitutes by the police when they're found drunken, naked, and surrounded by Pakistani men. They're the children that our snobbish state treats as white working class trash that is beneath contempt. In 2017, Ed Hussein and Majid Nawaz's Quilliam Foundation found that of the 264 people convicted for the crime of group-based child exploitation since 2005, 222, 84%, were ethnically Asian, so that means Indian and Pakistani. In 2025, the Hydrant program found that Pakistani men commit group-based child grooming offences at 4 times 17% per capita the rate of white British males. The data was gathered from all 43 police forces across England and Wales, meaning the nature of the abuse, child exploitation networks operating with a colour of clannish solidarity among Pakistani communities in specific towns and cities, was obscured. as the gangs operate in regions where white British neighbourhoods border Pakistani enclaves. Baroness Louise Casey's 2015 report found children were exploited by men who came largely from the Pakistani heritage community in Rotherham. Quote, perpetrators in Rotherham appear to have been largely from the Pakistani heritage community. Perpetrators used what is known as street grooming to prepare their victims for exploitation. Some of the exploitation was connected to a nucleus of men or gangs of men who were already involved in criminal activity, including supplying drugs, trafficking, exploitation, and prostitution across Rotherham and South Yorkshire. There were other less organised groups of predatory men who would seek out girls and form emotional bonds with them. Girls would be contacted initially by phone or by text, often by a young adult male who they had met on the street, or in the shopping centre or park. These younger men who carried out the grooming weren't always the abuser. Girls were misled into believing these men were their boyfriends. Once their trust had been gained, the girls were vulnerable to abuse and were even shared and passed around by other groups of men. Victims would start to receive phone calls from numerous other males wishing to meet them and engage in sexual acts, and be pressured by their boyfriend into doing what was asked. They would be picked up in taxis and cars from schools or children's homes, or from their own family homes. Girls would go missing from home regularly and for extended periods. They would be taken to restaurants or to other properties where they would be forced to have sex with one or more men. They were given drugs and alcohol, which they then had to pay for in sex, so they were in a form of sexual indentured servitude. If they did not concur, they would be subjected to rape, multiple rapes, rape with physical violence, and threatened with weapons. In Rotherham, the phenomenon of CSE emerging from the late 1990s onwards concerned a majority of white female adolescent or teenage victims, and a majority of Pakistani heritage adult male perpetrators. Early concerns raised about CSE by youth workers and others had also repeatedly mentioned taxi drivers. This predominant involvement of Pakistani heritage men was certainly the view of all of those who inspectors spoke to, who had been close to operational work around street grooming and CSE in Rotherham in the previous 15 years. Victims share this view. Our review of case files and strategy meetings held about perpetrators and victims, as well as other information we came across, confirmed that perpetrators were usually described as being Pakistani men. This was a matter of fact. The follow-up Casey review a decade later found, quote, national data on ethnicity recorded against suspects is poor, whether collected through self-determination or ethnic appearance. It is not good enough to support any statements about the ethnicity of group-based child exploitation offenders at the national level, but her audit found that 28% of child exploitation offenders were white, and 66% had no ethnicity recorded. So that means that a lion's share of this kind of abuse was not perpetrated by white British men. In Manchester, she found that Asians made up 20.9% of the population, but 54% of child abuse offence suspects. In Rotherham, ethnic Pakistanis make up 4% of the population, but 64% of designated suspects and 62% of convicted suspects in Operation Stovewood investigations. In West Yorkshire, 35% of suspects were Asian compared to 34% white. 24% of suspects did not have their ethnicity recorded, meaning Asians could be overrepresented by 2 to 4 times their share of the local population among child exploitation offence suspects, and Pakistanis by 21 times their share of the national population. And Casey confirmed on Sky News when she was doing interviews after the publication of her audit that in one document she saw the word Pakistani tipexed out in a child's case file. Even those attempting to deny the Pakistani Muslim composition of the rape gangs have found conflicting reports in their own research. Dr. Ella Cockbain, who is The Guardian's go-to academic to dismiss the concerns about the rape gangs, has long denied a link between Pakistani Muslim men and group-based child exploitation. She accused the Times reporter, Andrew Nether, who is one of the most prominent whistleblowers on all of this, she accused his reporting of being fatuous, based on embellished anecdotes and inaccurate statistics, and alleged that the rape gangs are part of a broader racist narrative in which the, quote, whiteness of the victims and offenders' otherness are both regularly overstated. Not by the statistics I've been reading to you here. Following the publication of the Home Office paper in 2020, which Dame Louise Casey said had made the erroneous assertion that white men are responsible, Cockbain and co-author Waqas Tufail wrote in The Guardian that, quote, for many in Britain today, the term grooming gang immediately suggests Pakistani heritage Muslim men abusing white girls, but Home Office researchers now tell us that, quote, researchers found that group-based offenders are most commonly white. A powerful, modern, racial myth has been exploded. What started as a far-right trope had migrated into the mainstream, meeting little resistance along the way. In 2011, The Times and its chief investigative reporter, Andrew Norfolk, claimed to have uncovered a new ethnic crime threat, shrouded until then in a supposed conspiracy of silence. The common denominator is not migration, race, culture, or Islam. Child abuse is the product of a complex interplay of patriarchy, power, exploitation, opportunity, and disregard for children. If we really want to tackle this issue, we have to stop fixating on the lurid and false distraction of Muslim grooming gangs. So explicitly denying the problem, making it much harder to solve the problem. But in 2025, Casey condemned the Home Office report and, thereby, Cockbain and Tusfail's triumphalism, saying, quote, "Quoted and requoted in official reports, the media and elsewhere, as proof that claims made about Asian grooming gangs are sensationalized or untrue, this audit found it hard to understand how the Home Office paper reached that conclusion, that white males were responsible, which does not seem to be evidence in research or data." So it wasn't true. The Home Office report actually cited a 2013 review that found that, quote, "Looking at the offenders across all groups, of the 306 offenders, 75% were Asian." Tufail also co-authored a paper called, quote, "Failing Victims Fueling Hate, Challenging the Harms of the Muslim Grooming Gangs Narrative," with Cockbain, which claimed, quote, "Muslim grooming gangs have become a defining feature of media, political, and public debate around child exploitation in the UK. The dominant narrative that has emerged to explain a series of horrific cases is misleading, sensationalist, and has in itself promoted a number of harms. This article examines how racist framings of Muslim grooming gangs exist, not only in extremist far-right fringes, but in mainstream liberal discourses too." However, Cockbain's own research found a 40-fold overrepresentation of Pakistani men among the perpetrators of 6 of the earliest and largest child trafficking investigations in the UK. Pakistanis comprised 80% of the perpetrators in Cockbain's own sample, despite them only making up 2% of the UK population at the time. While Cockbain admits a, quote, "clear ethnic patterning to the offenders," she writes that she, quote, "cannot offer a clear and definitive explanation as to why there were so many Asian offenders on these 6 cases. She instead presumes that police brutality and racial profiling is to blame. This is because liberal ideology prohibits her from drawing the truthful conclusion that Pakistani men are disproportionately likely to target white children for exploitation and abuse. Because, as Shabir Ahmed was honest about, they see non-Muslims and non-Pakistanis as racially and religiously inferior. The reason that I'm reading all of this out is because this wasn't contained in the rape gang inquiry. So there wasn't as comprehensive a study of previous academic literature and reports into victim and perpetrator demographics of the grooming gangs as there should have been. And again, this was provided to them, but I guess it just got lost among the papers in the pile that the barrister was having to consult. And we have to be a little bit charitable here because the testimonies were harrowing, there were days of evidence, mountains of paperwork, so I understand why it might have slipped through the cracks. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because the inquiry has been criticised for its claims around the number of victims, the motivations behind the perpetrators, it being potentially too focused on Islamic scripture and not enough on the ethnic Pakistani dimensions and the clan mentality and morality of these Biradiri clan structures that form drug and trafficking gangs in Britain. And it has been criticised by credible people, not just people who have a political motivation to discredit the report because they are rivals to Restore Britain, the political party that was launched after the hearings concluded. They've been made by the likes of Adam Wren of Open Justice. Adam is a gentleman, he does excellent work corresponding with victims, procuring the transcripts of trials, because currently victims have to pay for the transcripts of their own trials. I will leave a link to his website down in the description where you can read some of the harrowing testimonies and the trial transcripts from the gangs. Adam is a good faith actor. His girlfriend Melissa is also lovely. They do some excellent work. So I don't want his criticisms to be misconstrued as politically motivated. After the report was published, Adam wrote, "There are specific factual claims in the report that warrant scrutiny. The figure of 250,000 victims has been circulated widely, presented as an established minimum. In fact, it originates from a 2019 House of Lords question by former UKIP leader Lord Pearson, who extrapolated from Rotherham's 1,400 victims to suggest a national estimate. Sarah Champion, Rotherham's MP, put the number as high as 1 million on similar reasoning. While there are many towns that share Rotherham's failures, not every town is Rotherham, and that kind of extrapolation doesn't hold up. Many survivors use this report as an opportunity to speak publicly for the first time, and claims that don't withstand scrutiny risk overshadowing their testimonies, which is a legitimate concern." And while this has been explained by Harrison Pitt and Josh Firm in subsequent interviews given to the likes of Jay Burden, that this was taking the modelling seriously and saying that in the absence of a credible national statistical model, in the absence of a proper statistical survey conducted by a national statutory inquiry, they're going to have to take this modelling seriously because this is the number that's been floated around for 7 years now. But it is true that there are demographic figures which make this number questionable. For example, not every town surveyed, included in the Rape Gang Inquiry report, has a substantial Pakistani population, like in Rotherham. However, that is changing with both the Boris wave and the sheer volume of illegal migrants being housed in dispersed accommodation and hotels across the country who are disproportionately responsible for committing sexual crimes against women and children. One way to produce a more accurate estimate is to use the existing and most up-to-date possible census data, combine it with the share of mosques, illicit businesses like vape shops and Turkish barbers populating a given town or city, and to cross-reference with existing case files to provide an estimate of the share of the Pakistani population and therefore the share of the likely victim population of white girls under the age of 18. That work hasn't been done yet, but I'm sure that such modelling would be beneficial if some capable people were to try to create it. Adam also picks up on the lack of emphasis on cousin marriage and clan dynamics in the report. He says, what produced these gangs in English towns was not religious ideology, but geography and kinship, dense, intermarried communities with their own authority structures, enough accumulated local power to capture institutions, and a strong instinct to close ranks against outside scrutiny. The presence of Islam in the abuse supplies the social glue and vocabulary rather than the motive. I think it's both, for the record, but he is correct that Islam acts as a bonding agent between members of the Ummah, and then, subordinate to that, the Pakistani clans that are consolidated in their consanguinity and clan structures by the imperative provided in Islam to marry your own cousins and keep a bond of blood brotherhood between believers that is not eradicated by the broader loyalties to fellow believers who do not share your blood in the Ummah. Adam writes, it is precisely the ordinariness of that motive that made this so dangerous. These were not acts of ideological warfare, but the product of communal loyalty. The banality is the point. And it is true that there is a certain counter-jihad narrative that can describe the grooming gangs as a concerted act of civilizational warfare. Now, there is certainly some of that from the perpetrators, like Shabir Ahmed and others, who have given statements to that effect. But the way the gangs are organised is based on cousin marriage, clannish solidarity. This is just a natural byproduct of importing people from a society where they marry their cousins at rates of 80 to 90%. Those people just shouldn't be imported into our country in the first place. In my contributions to the report, I did outline how cousin marriage consolidates this ethno-nepotistic tribalism that is used, as Adam said, as a social glue for the gangs to form. The clannish mentality is entrenched by high rates of cousin marriage in the Muslim world and within Muslim enclaves in Britain. The first Archbishop of Canterbury banned consanguinity in England on the instructions of Pope Gregory I in 597 AD, centuries before the Catholic Church's Fourth Lateran Council formalised the prohibition in 1215. England's individualistic morality was produced by low rates of cousin and child marriage, private property protections under common law, and a resulting nuclearised family structure. Alan Macfarlane's The Origins of English Individualism is very explicit about this. Moral consideration was extended to those outside the immediate and extended family for centuries, resulting in our default assumption being that everyone basically thinks like us. But cousin marriage is common across the Muslim world. Patrick Nash's academic work is excellent on this. There remain high rates in Syria and Iran, 30 to 39%, Sudan and Afghanistan, 40 to 49%. It's worth noting as well that Afghanistan is the most lead-poisoned country in the world and has very high rates of opiate addiction too. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, 50 to 59%, Pakistan, 65%, and Kuwait, 68%. Some 80% of marriages worldwide, throughout history, have been consanguineous. In Pakistani enclaves in Bradford, rates of cousin marriage are between 40 to 60%. This reflects the consanguinity rate of 65% in Pakistan, but some Baradari clans practice cousin marriage rates exceeding 90%, and just speaking to some Pakistanis who have broken away from their inherited culture, this is still going on. They're still facing pressure from their parents to get married to their cousins. These clans exercise influence over local politicians and MPs, as Ed Hussein's Among the Mosques details with various anecdotes from imams and even female Muslim politicians who have been threatened, attacked, and pressured by male elders in Pakistani communities. Despite being only 4% of the population, Pakistanis produce 30% of babies with congenital birth defects in Britain. Pakistani infants have the highest rate of infant mortality in Britain. A University of Bedfordshire study found that Pakistanis blame birth defects and infant deaths on black magic and position during pregnancy or intercourse, rather than understanding the deleterious effect of consanguinity on genetic health. Cousin marriage results in offspring with lower average IQs and impulse control, while also entrapping a person in an incestuous, close-knit clan structure without any sense of agency. An individualistic ethic is therefore alien to these clans, communities, and people in such circumstances. Geographic proximity further entrenches this clan network. When Professor Roger Ballard polled Pakistanis living in Britain in 1987, he found 75% could trace their ancestry to the same 600 square miles in the Mirpur district in Azad, Kashmir, and those Pakistanis migrated over to Britain when a dam burst and the region flooded in the 50s. The tribal dynamics of rural Pakistan have therefore been transported and continued in towns and cities across Britain, and so the rape gangs operate using tribal networks of friends, family members, and extended kin, relying on a shared understanding of the subordinate status of women, a shamelessness about having sex with the same woman, and a sense of solidarity between participants along familial and ethnic lines. And yes, this is present in Islam, but it's not purely the fault of Islam. It's just reinforced by Islam. Islam is the scriptural and juridical encodification of the habits and customs that Pakistanis just do anyway. So having Pakistanis in your country will inevitably just lead to more clannish behaviour and sex crimes, whether or not they observe Jummah and go to mosque every Friday. An anecdote from Baroness Gohir's 2013 Muslim Women's Network report exemplifies this. Quote, "My mate called me and said, 'Bro, I have a surprise for you, come over to the house.' When I got there, 15 of them were sitting in the living room. My mate told me to go upstairs for my surprise. When I went into the bedroom, another friend was doing this girl. She was 20 years old and Pakistani. The lads went up one by one and took turns. While they were waiting, they were calling their mates, cousins, and uncles to come over and join in and show off. Others turned up too, including 2 older men who were taxi drivers who went upstairs. One older man said, 'I'm going to call my son over so he can practice on her,' and his 15-year-old son arrived in uniform. Everyone took turns, and it took 6 hours. I did get concerned and said, 'The girl is going to get broke, who will marry her? The girl is not paid, but she gets looked after, given food, and the boys make sure she gets home safely if she gets late. There are set days, Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, but some of my friends don't like doing stuff like that on a Friday because it's Jummah, holy day, and they go to mosque.' He then went on to recount another story of a group of 6 boys in their late teens calling their friends to come and have sex with a girl they had in a house. He explained that often the girl went out with one of the boys, who then passed her on to another friend, who then passed her on until everyone starts sharing her. One male youth said, 'It's been going on for years. I've heard guys are making money by passing girls around. It's a business for them.' You don't understand how these people think. And this is why, despite this going on in the community, members of the community cover it up, including the wives and daughters of the rapists, who themselves are abused by the men. During a 2024 rape gang trial in Rotherham, relatives of the rapists were dead-eyeing a victim in court. One instructed another to slap the bitch, one of the survivors, causing the National Crime Agency's officers and court security to intervene. As rapist Mohammed Siab's sentence was read out by the judge, one of his daughters cried out, 'I love you, Dad.' They know what their families are doing and they cover up for it anyway, because of the clan morality and mentality. It's a them v us mentality, which then causes them to justify the abuse that the girls suffer. We have known of this community remorselessness for years. Indian Muslim journalist Yasmin Alipai Brown, herself progressive, so admitting these things reluctantly, interviewed the wives and daughters of perpetrators and found they were willing to excuse the abuse inflicted on white children, despite having been abused themselves, according to Islamic dress codes and the fact that they weren't a member of their family. Quote, "I learned that they too had been subject to despicable abuse, but I discovered that trapped in a world of obedience and ignorance, too many also blame the white teenage victims for leading their abusers on." Much like Shabir Ahmed saying the girls were more advanced in sex and had tempted the men. Quote, "I asked the women how they would feel if their children had been drugged and raped. They agreed it would break their hearts, but Mariam said, 'It can't happen to our children because they're not in the streets. We look after them.' Only Nusrat and Neela were prepared to condemn the abuse without reservation. The others, it seemed, privately blamed the girls and even their parents. It became clear they had a very confused sense of morality. Or it's just consistent with the us v them mentality of clan morality in Pakistan. But later at a separate meeting, I encountered Suju, the wife of another jailed groomer. She was afraid of him, but she too thinks the white girls are, quote, 'filthy how they dress. They have no shame, no fear of Allah.' Was it okay to hurt them the way the men did? I asked. 'No, you can't hurt people. Allah does not want that,' she replied. 'But it's the girls who should be careful. They did something to him. Maybe bad magic. I am alone. No money, no life.' The women think that young white children are perennial temptresses, potentially unleashing jinns and spirits on their husbands, brothers, sons, cousins. that force them to abuse children. They take no responsibility. It's why they never plead guilty. They do not see us as moral equals. They do not see your children as deserving of innocence or protection. You cannot live with these people. In another article for The Times, Alapai Brown acknowledged that, quote, within too many Asian families, white females are disrespected and despised and the intolerable is tolerated. This form of cultural supremacy excuses and validates appalling offences against outsiders. And in a piece for The Independent, she says, the criminals feel they did no wrong. These girls to them are trash, asking to be wasted, unlike their own women, who must be kept from the disorderly world out there. The whore and the virgin are both feared and severely controlled and abused. A 2005 study in the Netherlands of Muslim males found the same bifurcation, and identified deep sexism as responsible for both. These are the loverboy gangs of mainly Moroccan and North African groomers that conduct the same patterns, because of Islam, cousin marriage, and clan mentality. The conversations can be heard every day around dining tables and on streets, Alapai Brown reported. They are embedded in thought and language. I once interviewed the mother of a man who had been convicted of repeatedly raping his younger wife, who came from a rural village in Pakistan. The head of the nursery school the couple's child attended had helped the victim report what was happening. In Urdu, the mother hissed, "How lucky was she to get my son, the dirty, ungrateful bitch. Went to a white woman to complain. They sleep with everybody. She just didn't know how to make him happy. We have thrown her out. She can go on the streets like those whites now." And Alapai Brown wonders if whether the rape gangs are motivated in part to inflict, quote, the most appalling payback for white racism on Britain out of some revenge fantasy for the empire. So, these people hold us collectively guilty for what they perceive we did to their ancestors, and so they are taking it out on our children. So this is more than just Islam as a motivating factor. And again, I'm emphasizing all of this because it was handed to the inquiry, it just didn't make it into the report. So I want to contrast this with the criticisms made in good faith by men like Adam Wren, who say there was a lack of focus on other reporting on the scale of the problem, the number of victims, the perpetrator demographics, and that there was an overemphasis on Islamic scripture as an ideological motivation and a lack of focus on cousin marriage and clan dynamics from Pakistan as a social glue that kept these networks of abuse together. Islam is also at fault here, as Dr. Taj Hargey has consistently said from 2013 to 2025, mullahs tell Pakistani males that white girls are a bunch of kafir, unbelievers, heathens, not worthy of anything. They are subhuman, and so they are white trash and white meat to be used by Pakistani men to have their kicks, so to speak. And many of them are in loveless arranged marriages, and they think this type of extramarital activity is wonderful for the ego and their sexual well-being. And it also doesn't count if you abuse a kafir, non-Muslim girl. He wrote in 2013 that the Oxford rape gang was bound up with religion and race. Quote, the fact is, the vicious activities of the Oxford ring are bound up with religion and race. Religion, because all the perpetrators, though they had different nationalities, were Muslim, and race, because they had deliberately targeted vulnerable white girls whom they appeared to regard as easy meat, to use one of their revealing, racist phrases. Indeed, one of the victims who bravely gave evidence in court told the newspaper afterwards that the men exclusively wanted white girls to abuse. But as so often in fearful, politically correct modern Britain, there is a craven unwillingness to face up to this reality. Commentators and politicians tiptoe around it, hiding behind weasel words. We're told that child abuse happens in all communities, that white men are really far more likely to be abusers, as has been shown by the fallout from the Jimmy Savile case. But all this is deluded nonsense. While it is, of course, true that abuse happens in all communities, no amount of obfuscation can hide the pattern that has been exposed in a recent series of chilling scandals from Rochdale to Oxford and Telford to Derby. In all these incidents, the abusers were Muslim men, and their targets were underage white girls. To pretend that this is not an issue for the Islamic community is to fall into a state of ideological denial. Another sign of the cowardly approach to these horrors is the constant reference to the criminals as Asians rather than as Muslims. In this context, Asian is a completely meaningless term. They weren't from China, or India, or Sri Lanka, or even Bangladesh. They were all from either Pakistan or Eritrea, which is in fact in East Africa, rather than Asia. What united them in their outlook was a twisted, corrupted mindset which bred their misogyny and racism. He claims that if they had been real, genuine followers of Islam, they wouldn't have dreamt of indulging in such vile crimes, for true Islam preaches respect for women and warns against all forms of sexual license, including adultery and exploitation. I suppose I have to dispute Dr. Hargey's interpretation on those grounds. Nevertheless, though, he says, by all accounts, this was not the version that these men heard in their mosques. On the contrary, they would have been drip-fed for years a far less uplifting doctrine, one that denigrates all women but treats whites with particular contempt. In the misguided orthodoxy that now prevails in many mosques, including several of those in Oxford, Men are unfortunately taught that women are second-class citizens, little more than chattel or possessions, over whom they have absolute authority. There was a telling incident in the trial when it was revealed that one of the thugs heated up some metal to brand a girl as if she were a cow. He branded her M for Muhammad. Now, if you have sex with someone else, he'll know that you belong to me, said this criminal, highlighting an attitude where women are seen as nothing more than personal property, or communal property, judging by the stories I've just read out. The view of some Islamic preachers towards white women can be appalling. They encourage their followers to believe these women are habitually promiscuous, decadent, and sleazy. Sins which are made all the worse by the fact that these are kafirs, or non-believers. Their dress code, from miniskirts to sleeveless tops, is deemed to reflect their impure and immoral outlook. According to this mentality, these white women deserve to be punished for their behaviour by being exploited and degraded. On one level, most imams in the UK are simply using their puritanical sermons to promote the wearing of the hijab, and even the burqa among their female adherents, but the dire result can be the brutish misogyny that we see in the Oxford sex ring. Hargay claims that the indoctrination of Muslims in largely Deobandi mosques, a sect of Islam that was established in Deoband, just outside of New Delhi in colonial-controlled India, that resented the British Empire, that was formulated as a kind of Islamic anti-colonial resistance that was exported to Britain and was encouraged by the Muslim Council of Britain, itself founded and organised by the Muslim Brotherhood according to a 2015 UK government report, but for some reason not shut down. The message extolled by these Deobandi mosques, an anti-white, anti-British message, which refuses to extend equal moral consideration to those outside the Ummah, are all highlighted as aggravating factors by Hargay. In January 2025, Hargay explained in an interview on GB News that the theology from mosques and elders is to perpetuate the idea of them and us. There is this ideology, the interpretation of Islam, which makes this possible. He said that Muslim rapists are told they will go to heaven before a Christian person. Quote, every Friday when the congregational prayers end, up and down the country, the Imam says we should condemn the disbelievers and the non-believers, and all of those who are not Muslim, and only Muslims are going to heaven. So when you have the idea of superiority, of supremacy, of segregationist mentality, then yes, these people then go out and they do bad things to these young, vulnerable girls, most of whom are in care. They abuse them and they use them as chewing gum. I met a Muslim here in Oxford. He said that the Muslim rapists would go to heaven before a Christian person. Unless we do address the toxic theology coming from the mosques and from the elders of the Muslim community, nothing much will change. Horrible example in Ed Hussein's book Among the Mosques, where he has a conversation with an imam in Bradford who liaises regularly with the government as a community elder to promote a positive face of Islam in Britain. And Ed asks, in Bradford and Yorkshire, what are the top issues that appear in your inbox? And the imam said, the police want to come into our mosques and speak to the congregants about not grooming white girls. It's been an issue in the past. In 2013, when imams in the group Together Against Grooming tried to read out a sermon, 75% of mosques refused to participate. And in the mosques that did participate, imams were shouted down by the congregation who didn't want the sermon to be read. And so Ed asks why the imam won't let it happen, when surely he's heard about what happened in Rotherham, how Muslim men targeted non-Muslim white girls for decades. And the imam says, what do these men have to do with Islam? He says, there are two factors involved in these cases, again and again, drugs and alcohol. Does Islam permit these things? Of course not. Yes, they have Muslim names and Pakistani backgrounds, but our mosques are not responsible for this criminality. Taj Hargay says differently, of course. These issues will be with us for a long time in Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, Keighley and other cities, but unless the police can prove it's not down to drugs and alcohol, an external factor acting on the men, yet again depriving them of any responsibility or agency, as if they're possessed by a Djinn, the imam said, we will not open the mosque doors to them. After a pause, he continues with a question. They're doing it again, can't you see? And Ed asks, what does he mean? The imam says, in 2010, they brought in laws to end corporal punishment. We as teachers in the mosque have no power over the children. They become teenagers and have no respect for us, because of course the only way in Islam to raise your child with discipline is to beat them mercilessly, rather than, reason with them and instill in them a conscience and a feeling of guilt for what they've done wrong. Again, this is the sort of thing that we do in Britain, but that these communities, clans and countries don't do, and they continue not to do them when they come to Britain, which is why they repeat the heinous behaviours of the rape gangs. The imam says, the British limited us to the four walls of the mosque, and then stopped our ability to control children, and now they're asking us to fix the problem of the grooming of white girls for sex. If not, they'll blame the mosques. These politicians and police always call us for support and help. They say give us a structure, a single leader. Many of them deal with me because I can help access a large section of the Muslim community. And our students ask us, when is the caliphate coming? I always say to them, do your part, qualify, take to community service and the mosque, and the caliphate will come. When it comes, we will swear allegiance to it because we must, as the fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence books, command. Until we have that single Muslim leadership and we give the oath of loyalty to the Caliph, we won't feel fully comfortable, and the British won't have a singular structure they can demand of us. A short silence followed between him and Ed, because this Imam is saying, we will do nothing to stop the abuse of white children by Muslims, and instead we will proactively work through dawah, proselytization, and infiltration of institutions, politics, like local councils, parliament, the civil service, even having the ear of Downing Street as a community leader. We will work to establish a caliphate, by which time there will be no need for us to deflect, deny, and downplay the threat of Muslim grooming gangs, because it will just become officially sanctioned by an Islamic State. There is no integration. It's not going to happen. And this is caused, yes, by Islam, but also by the clan cousin marrying networks that Adam Wren was right to highlight was neglected as a consideration in the rape gang inquiry. It's important to note something that the inquiry overlooked, despite Charlie Downs, when talking about the inquiry, saying that was investigated, and that is the organised crime network that facilitates the trafficking, drugs, and abuse, and also provides future perpetrators by enabling people smuggling. And this is something that I actually included in my submission to the report, but again, didn't make it in. I worked with a source in the Home Office in 2023 who said that people smuggling gangs were targeting, at the time, Algerian and Moroccan men, using videos on Instagram and TikTok, contrasting videos of girls filmed in states of undress, drunken, on nights out in the likes of London and Manchester, with footage of churches burning, men crossing the English Channel on dinghies, and footage of men cutting barbed wire fences and breaking into Europe, or immediately going and working as Deliveroo cyclists after arriving in the UK, to market their services to Muslim men, with the promise that if you go to Britain, there will be white girls waiting for you. Social media companies have since partnered with the National Crime Agency to remove smuggling adverts on their platforms, but a Daily Mail investigation in December 2025 revealed the predatory practice is still going on, now targeting prospective clients from the Gujar ethnic community in India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. One of their agents is in the UK, walking around nightclubs and UK university campuses, doing candid videos with white women who are unaware that they're being used as marketing material for these people smuggling gangs, for prospective emigres to Britain via illegal means. A BBC investigation in February 2026 contacted nearly 50 women who had been filmed from behind or at low angles, sometimes revealing intimate parts of their body without their consent, and they were unaware they were being used online by lurid walking tours or nightlife content by accounts on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, which is then incorporated into these adverts. The BBC identified more than 65 of these channels, with views totaling more than 3 billion over the last 3 years. YouTube had deactivated 2 accounts, and TikTok removed 4 channels after being notified by the BBC. Videos on Facebook and Instagram still remain active. Florjan and Roland Raker, who are 2 brothers from Albania who moved from Sweden to Manchester, were identified as the operators of some of the most lucrative YouTube accounts. But we know that other Muslim men, other organised crime syndicates are also operating the same practice. And this is why sexual assaults on women in Britain's nightclubs are becoming increasingly common. One example was a Syrian male asylum seeker, Fawaz Al-Samu, who was sentenced to 37 months in prison in 2025 for following his victim out of a Cardiff nightclub, strangling and assaulting her under a bridge. Asmalu was living in Yorkshire at the time, so again, they're travelling all across the country to do this. Another is Afghan asylum seeker Merwaiz Naziri, who crossed the channel via a small boat in 2022 and abducted and attempted to assault an intoxicated 20-year-old woman from a nightclub in Exeter. Naziri was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison, with a 4-year extended licence and placed on the sex offenders register for life in 2024. Louise Casey revealed in her audit that a significant proportion of these cases appear to involve suspects who are non-UK nationals and or who are claiming asylum in the UK, which means that the illegal immigrant trafficking trade is bolstering the numbers of the rape gangs. And in May 2026, 7 Afghan asylum seekers were charged with 40 offences connected to group-based child exploitation in Norwich. The charges relate to just 2 victims, who were aged in their early to mid-teens at the time. And this £5.2 billion trade is financed by Hawala, an 8th century Islamic finance system which relies on that clannish loyalty, that asabaya among members of the Ummah and among the ethnic clans of Pakistan or the Gujar community that crosses different countries like Afghanistan, India and Pakistan, to ensure that money can be exchanged via word of mouth so that the actual subjects of the smuggling don't have to carry the cash themselves, and so that it's harder for authorities in our countries to detect. But they're using Turkish barbers, vape shops, phone shops as laundering fronts for the cash exchanges and to arrange smuggling of family members from one country to ours. And for as much as the Islamic ideological motivation is contested between the report and its critics, the sixth unspoken pillar of Islam is hijra, the duty Muslims have to emigrate and evangelize by word, dawah, or by the sword, with the House of War. Just as Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina in 622 and founded Islam and then went and waged war against all of the Jewish and pagan tribes in 7th century Arabia. As historian Tom Holland explains, evangelization via emigration constitutes a duty incumbent upon all believers, no matter their circumstances, no matter their location. Far from alluding to a single journey into exile, whether to Yathrib or to anywhere else, it seems to imply a call to arms that is all-embracing, universal, and unbounded by time or place. Anyone who migrates for God's cause will find many a refuge and great plenty in earth. Nothing could conceivably have sounded more radical or terrifying to the Prophet's audience. Abandoning family and tribe was the most stomach-churning prospect imaginable for any Arab, and yet if the Quran is to be trusted, this was precisely the commitment the Prophet was demanding, and not just of his own people, but of all the various descendants of Ishmael, wherever they might live, across the entire sweep of Arabia. The successful planting of his banner in Yathrib, set against the backdrop of the apparent breaking of the world, was only to be the start. All those with the courage, or perhaps the sheer desperation to accept the Prophet's challenge and embark on a new beginning, were invited to join him on a journey that might lead God alone knew where. Elsewhere in the Quran, verses praise those who emigrate to spread Islam. Surah At-Tawbah 9:20 says, "Those who have believed, emigrated and strived in the cause of Allah, with their wealth and their lives, are greater in rank in the sight of Allah. It is they who will triumph." Surah An-Nisa 4:100 says, "Whoever emigrates in the cause of Allah will find many safe havens and bountiful resources throughout the earth. Those who leave their homes and die while emigrating to Allah and His Messenger, their reward has already been secured with Allah, and Allah is all-forgiving, most merciful." So emigration and conquest and the expansion of Islam is a religious duty for all Muslims, and some, it seems, are taking this very seriously. In the overview of crime section on page 11, the inquiry explained that the independent chair of the Centre for Excellence for Children's Care and Protection, Alexis J., identified the 1970s as the date when immigrant rape gangs first began tormenting the girls of Britain. However, the British Newspaper Archive reveals that the first recorded case of specifically Pakistani rape gangs dates back to 1955, when 4 Bradford-based Pakistanis were charged with raping a 15-year-old girl from Middlesbrough. This was soon after former colonial subjects from the subcontinent, as much as the Caribbean, became eligible to enter the UK in non-trivial numbers under the British Nationality Act 1948. That means that the rape gangs began when the first waves of migrants came from Kashmir, Mirpur, Pakistan. So this problem has persisted for 70 years and is inextricable from Pakistani immigration. And as that migration spreads, the report in its appendix lists 149 local authorities where the rape gangs are known to have operated, and some of these are new locations identified by the inquiry. So despite it not having statutory powers, the inquiry still does conduct some valuable research to point a future national statutory inquiry in the right direction, to investigate places that would have otherwise been overlooked. These 149 local authorities make up almost 40% of all districts across the UK. This is a map of the affected areas. It's all over the country. This is what has been done to our children by men who never needed to be here in the first place. Pages 15 to 17 identify London as a particular area of concern, one of the reasons why it's now being focused on as one of the 3 areas for the limited statutory inquiries by the government. And it highlights Sadiq Khan's consistent, insidious denial of the rape gangs, and says, "These statements were made despite the Metropolitan Police holding reports of young girls being plied with alcohol and drugs and then raped by groups of men in hotels and other locations across the capital. A Daily Express investigation revealed that Khan had direct access to His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary documents detailing exactly these patterns of offending. He read the files, yet continued to deny the existence of grooming gangs in public." But both parties' hands are bloodied by this, as we've already mentioned. Sajid Javid and the Labour government. The inquiry notes a series of politicians decided to ignore these crimes for decades. The Labour Party bears primary responsibility for the longest and most deliberate cover-up. As former Conservative councillor Liam Billington emphasised during the inquiry, Labour-dominated councils and MPs repeatedly prioritised electoral dependence on the Pakistani Muslim communities above the safety of children. Jess Phillips and Naz Shah maintained public silence on the ethnic and religious patterns of the gangs while their constituencies suffered. Evidence showed Labour politicians prioritised avoiding far-right empowerment narratives and ensuring so-called community relations over protecting victims. In Oldham, Labour councillors and leadership received one of our whistleblower social workers' disclosures on trafficking inside the council-run and semi-independent units, yet retaliated against the whistleblower and took no remedial action. The same pattern occurred in Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Burnley and Peterborough. Labour councils surrendered streets, ignored parental reports and allowed perpetrators to operate, among other reasons, because Muslim voting blocks were electorally vital. As Dennis McShane, the disgraced former Labour MP for Rotherham between 1994 and 2012, told the BBC, he had refrained from investigating abuse by local Pakistanis because, quote, I think there was a culture of not wanting to rock the multicultural community boat, if I may put it like that. As a Guardian reading liberal lefty, McShane said the implications of the racial and religious nature of the gangs troubled him. Quote, I wouldn't pick particularly on one ethnic community, but it is a real problem. It's a larger story about the nature of that community, their sexual relations, and the way they treat women in particular within that community. There is a big problem. When I met the imams and my friends, they were always as horrified as I was at any of the local newspaper reports. Simon Danchuk, the former Labour MP for Rochdale and inexplicably Reform UK's candidate for the 2024 Rotherham by-election, basically did the same. When Katie Hopkins was working for The Sun and she said that Danchuk was disgraceful for posing with a Pakistani flag, given Rochdale was an epicentre of Pakistani rape gangs, he reported her to the police. In Telford, the former Conservative MP, Lucy Allen, told The Telegraph, people in power believed that being honest about what had happened to the girls would fuel racial tensions. They pushed a narrative that hiding the problem was in the interests of the community, that looking the other way would cement social cohesion and protect society. Councillors in Rotherham protested the J report. 70% accused Professor J of misrepresenting data, of sampling bias, of flawed methodology, and an intent to defame the Pakistani community. They also accused reporting by Andrew Norfolk in The Times of picking on a Labour authority on the back of Rochdale, and that Norfolk had a thing about Pakistani men, and that the story was exaggerated. In the early days, the message was that Norfolk has got it in for us. Baroness Casey attributed racial sensitivities around the small, then only 3%, and concentrated Pakistani community in Rotherham to why the council, police and social services ignored the operation of rape gangs in the town. The following are a series of quotes from the Rotherham report written by Casey. Quote, Rotherham isn't a very PC place. I think that's why the council overcompensated too much. It doesn't want to be accused of being racist. It is known that this happens. Perpetrators have been known to say, I'll use the race card, according to a former police officer. Another former officer says, we weren't allowed to hold forums near pubs because it might upset the Muslim people. Muslim colleagues thought this was silly. Another officer said, politicians wanted to use any other word than Asian males. They were terrified of the impact on community cohesion. Another officer, my current experience of the council, as it was and is, Asian men very powerful, and the white British are very mindful of racism and frightened of racism allegations, so there's no robust challenge. They had a massive influence in the town. For example, I know all the backgrounds to the Asian councillors, but don't know anything about the white members. Not about race, only about the power and influence. The family links in those communities are still very strong. Definitely an issue of race. One councillor said, it's difficult to ask questions regarding Pakistani heritage. There was a sense that Pakistani heritage councillors, who alone dealt with that community, inspectors believe this is inappropriate. It would not, of course, have reflected Rotherham's equality policy, or indeed the One Town, One Community campaign. In fact, it would. Because the ideology of equality mandates that if we are truly all the same, but we have unequal outcomes, then you need to discriminate in the present in favour of the disadvantaged, or disproportionately criminal and impoverished group, against the interests of the native white British host majority. Pakistani heritage councillors had and have, whether acquired or taken, a disproportionate influence in the council, particularly on issues which appeared to affect the Pakistani heritage community, such as the taxi trade. Quote, I think what we're probably talking about is the disproportionate influence one particular community has, how it punches above its weight, and the power these politicians have, according to one councillor. Remember, again, they've just jailed a Pakistani taxi driver who ran as a Labour council candidate in 2016 for being a member of the grooming gangs with his brothers. Quote, I've got my knuckles rapped by a manager on that occasion for mentioning Asian taxi drivers. She had been told what I'd said was controversial and not to mention ethnicity, according to a youth worker. Quote, they were running scared of the race issue. There is no doubt that in Rotherham this has been a problem with Pakistani men for years and years. People were scared of being called racist, according to a former police officer. On the ground, individual professionals felt under pressure. Quote, we had specific instances where taxis were involved in child exploitation. We tried to follow it up with taxi licensing, but I can't remember how far we got. We were constantly being reminded not to be racist, according to a former social worker. Another social worker recalled a strategy meeting about an exploited young person where Pakistani heritage taxi drivers were referred to as men of a certain ethnicity engaged in a particular occupation. So that's beyond useless when profiling perpetrators and safeguarding victims. Quote, "If we mentioned Asian taxi drivers, we were told we were racist and the young people were seen as prostitutes," according to a former social worker. "You couldn't bring up race issues in meetings, or you'd be branded a racist, a key partner." The number one priority was to preserve and enhance the Pakistani heritage community, which wasn't an unworthy goal, but it wasn't right at the time. No, it's always an unworthy goal to preserve and enhance a community which perpetrates such unspeakable crimes on another. It was difficult to stand up in a meeting and say that the perpetrators were from the Pakistani heritage community and were using the taxi system, even though everyone knew it, a former key partner. We'd be at community meetings talking about community issues. When there, we discussed targeting taxi drivers and the Pakistani heritage community in relation to CSE. We were even discussing particular families we had concerns about. These members would push back. Neither believed the extent of the problem that we were trying to communicate. They were saying to us it will cause a lot of community tension if they're targeted specifically, and we wanted their support. So they did nothing, according to a police officer. There was an attitude at the time of wanting to deal with CSE, but there was a general feeling it was best done without publicity. So there would be no bad publicity to Rotherham, a former senior officer. X didn't want the town to become the child abuse capital of the North. They didn't want riots. Another senior officer. We put things to them, ideas for campaigns, but they were never allowed. I remember in 2006 and 2007, a campaign we proposed, they wouldn't let us do it. They wanted to give a certain impression of Rotherham, another officer. I got a phone call from him. "I think we need a chat. Let's just call it a one-to-one." I thought it was to see how things were going. He told me to move on. He said, "We think you're rocking the boat." I did a resignation letter about a fortnight later. The father of a victim. Quote, "I've sat in a meeting with police where they've said, we need to stop making stories sound worse than they are," a youth worker. So it's undeniable that anti-racism, accusations of racism, political correctness, were all wielded as a cudgel to silence whistleblowers, to prevent victims from being protected, and from perpetrators from being profiled and punished, in Rotherham and across other towns in the country. And it's clear politicians and the media were responsible for perpetuating that chilling effect all throughout Britain's institutions. That means the gangs continue operating to this day. Police officers actually arrested and abused the victims themselves. The girls were blamed for a lot of what happened. It's unbelievable and key to why it wasn't taken seriously, according to one officer. There was no awareness. The view of the police was that they were little slags, a key partner. The police didn't understand the situation, and they thought that the girls were happy or complicit in it. The sense was that if there had been an offence, it had been the girls for luring the men in, a key partner. It's almost as if they were second-class citizens. The girls were blamed a lot for what happened. It's unbelievable and key as to why it wasn't taken seriously as an issue, a former police officer. Child 3, aged 13, was found by the police at 3 a.m. in a semi-derelict house, alone with a large group of adult males. She was drunk, the result of having been supplied with alcohol, and there was evidence that her clothing had been disrupted. She had been abused. She alone was arrested for a public order offence, detained, prosecuted, appeared before the youth court and received a referral order for which the YOT arranged reparation, drug and alcohol counselling, art psychotherapy and victim awareness sessions. "Don't worry, you aren't the first girl to be raped by X and you won't be the last," said one police officer to a victim. Children's Services actually characterised one 13-year-old victim called Child K, in Casey's report, as being responsible for being groomed and gang-raped by the men who then went on to drug and prostitute her. Quote, "K has willingly gone with abusers, N, M, and an unnamed man, in their car to a flat in a certain location. She admitted use of alcohol and drugs and to have consented to sexual activity. A child cannot consent. You are sick. N put her in a bedroom and made her give blowjobs to about 5 men, sending one in at a time. K presents as knowledgeable and aware of what she's doing. However, she has problems sticking to her resolutions when offered the excitement. I suggest she needs more appropriate friends and interests to fill her time." The contempt that social workers, the police, nurses working in the NHS showed for these children really does emphasise why they were delivered into the clutches of these Pakistani perpetrators. Baroness Casey concluded, quote, "Bluntly, senior staff and children's social care know what is wrong, but are either incapable of putting it right or lack the will or capacity to do so. They're complicit. They're just as complicit as new Prime Minister Andy Burnham." The report indicts him by quoting former Detective Constable and Rochdale rape gang whistleblower Maggie Oliver, who criticised Andy Burnham's tenure as Mayor of Greater Manchester for the series of inquiries that he launched between 2017 and the early 2020s, which found that yes, Greater Manchester Police had treated victims like criminals and vigilantes, had misplaced or willfully binned bits of evidence, had in some cases collaborated with the gangs themselves. And yet not a single social worker, police officer, senior executive was prosecuted or lost their jobs for that. And Oliver said, What I'd come to see and believe is that while the PR machine was wheeled out very well about what was already in the public arena, when it comes to leadership and courage and gripping what is going on now, unfortunately, Burnham turned away. We missed a huge opportunity to bring changes that are needed. And now Andy Burnham is supervising the government that is running these local statutory inquiries, with Pakistani Muslim Shabana Mahmood in the Home Office, at the same time that Burnham is increasing the foreign aid budget and giving hundreds of millions to Pakistan who are refusing to take back their rapists, while they're sending us more via legal migration and illegals crossing on small boats, enticed by videos created by people smugglers filming British women and girls in states of relative undress by Muslim standards from low angles, without their consent, marketing Britain as a brothel that these men can come over and exploit to their heart's content. As the report says, this is the same Labour Party that consistently weaponizes accusations of Islamophobia to silence anyone who stated the obvious, that the gangs were and remain overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslim men. As a result, the nation has suffered decades of state-enabled child rape on an industrial scale. It condemns the Conservative Party too. They say, the Conservative Party, when holding national power from 2010 onwards, failed to impose mandatory ethnicity recording for child abuse offenders, and failed to launch a nationwide statutory inquiry, despite the scale becoming public through the Rotherham J report and other local revelations, as well as the Telford inquiry. It's also worth noting that while Women and Equalities Minister, current Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch, didn't speak about the grooming gangs in Parliament once. They also cite proud Islamophile, the former Conservative Minister Rory Stewart. Stewart once stated on his podcast with Alistair Campbell, The Rest is Politics, that the grooming gang phenomenon is no more than a small-scale blight largely confined to the north of England. Again, it's that snobbish, middle-class contempt shown for white working-class children, which acts as if they basically deserve the abuse at the hands of the immigrant client blocks that they gleefully import into the country. George Osborne did the same thing with Ed Balls on their podcast, which is a similar format of two uniparty politicians pretending to disagree, but actually just admitting to their complicity in the ruin of our nation while they were in their respective governments. George Osborne says that the Conservative government under Cameron knew about the grooming gangs, but didn't think it was an issue they could successfully exploit for political capital against Labour, so didn't touch it.
I don't know about you as Chancellor, as part of the government in that period. Certainly, I was Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Families. We had responsibility for tackling child sex abuse. We were, would go after any time when institutions were failing. I mean, post Climbier, Baby P, and all of the problems about poor communication. But at that time, this wasn't coming across the desks of cabinet ministers. I mean, I don't know whether you ever had any dealings with it. I didn't.
I didn't directly. I mean, there was definitely, there was the emerging prosecutions in places like Rotherham. And I guess there was a sense in Conservative circles that, this was embarrassing for Labour because these areas were run by Labour councils, that the Labour councils often drew a lot of support from the local Pakistani origin community, that they didn't want to kind of call it out. There was definitely, but we never thought that was something that you could sort of politically exploit, frankly.
Really? I mean, I would have thought if you thought this was something which was embarrassing for Labour, you would have thought it was a way to politically. I mean,
the inquiry places a heavy premium on the role of Islam in the abuse, as some have criticised to the detriment of examining the Pakistani ethnic dimension and the role of cousin marriage and clan networks, despite various members of Restore Britain, like Rupert Lowe, speaking about this in other interviews. On page 8 and 9, it says, the demographic and cultural drivers are clear. Perpetrators from Pakistani Muslim and other Muslim backgrounds operated under an honour and shame-based clan code that treated non-Muslim girls, especially white working-class girls, as property available for sexual use. This pattern was reinforced by 8 theological and legal aspects of Islam. These include the doctrine of Muslim superiority, drawn from Quranic verses, that position Muslims at the top with a duty to correct non-believers. The gang members' justification for their crimes can be found in the Islamic principles of loyalty and disavowal known as al-wala wal-bara. It demands enmity towards non-Muslims, the superiority of men over women, forced marriage combined with the absence of any fixed minimum age of consent, the perception of female sexuality as inherently dangerous, a system of sex slavery that authorises sexual relations with non-Muslim captives, and actually emphasises the desirability of white women, or the people of yellow, or Isnad, as their Prophet Muhammad himself said, according to various hadiths, and a religiously sanctioned social hierarchy that subjugates conquered non-Muslims, dhimmis. These elements, filtered through clannish immigrant subcultures, provided religious justification that enabled the systematic rape and even slaughter of white British girls. As a preface to a lengthy section on Islamic scripture and how it informed the abuse, on page 118, the report says at least 8 theological aspects of Islam may contribute to cultural patterns that enable or normalize the sexual abuse of non-Muslim girls. These include the doctrine of Muslim superiority, the principle of loyalty and disavowal, al-wala wal-bara, male dominance over women, enforced seclusion and veiling of women, forced marriage combined with the absence of a fixed minimum age of consent, the perception of female sexuality as inherently dangerous, or fitna, the desire to wage jihad, war, or struggle against sources of temptation, and the historical Sharia institution of slavery, and the system of dhimitude, the servitude of non-Muslims. Examples from Islamic scripture are listed across pages 118 to 120. For example, Surah 3:110 that says, "You Muslims are the best nation raised up for humankind, commanding what is good and forbidding what is wrong and believing in Allah. If only the people of the book, Christians and Jews, believed, it would be better for them. Some among them are believers, but most are perverted." Or Surah 48:28, "It is He, Allah, who has sent his messenger with the guidance and the religion of truth Islam to make it triumph over every religion." Or Surah 8:55, "Surely the worst of animals in Allah's sight are rejectors of Islam, they do not believe." Surah 9:28 labels associators, Christians, Jews and non-Muslims, as unclean, and this is corroborated by victims' accounts. One panelist asked a survivor, "You're saying the staff at the home were selling you to foreign men?" And she says, "Yes, it very much looked like it. Something was being set up. They knew the names of the children, they were all hanging around in back-to-back taxis." One survivor recalls how an abuser would toot the horn of their car, and then the care home staff would take a child to the front door to be collected by the perpetrators. They were selling them off. One says there was a circle of Pakistani nationals, and they were pointing to the children as if they were choosing them like at an auction. It was all of the white girls in every home that I went to, and I mean, I've seen girls locked. I remember a man opening the back of a van and I saw maybe 15, 20 girls locked in dog cages, looking like they're on drugs. The pseudonymous Rotherham survivor, Dr. Ella Hill, described the language that she suffered during her abuse as that of Muslim superiority, denigrating non-Muslims, kuffar, non-believers. She says that she had to, during gang rapes by dozens of men, lick their feet clean because they believed they were morally superior to her. She says it's a Muslim superiority thing. They believe they have maximal moral authority to command the people beneath them to lick their feet. She says the rapists who she had to sup with viewed non-Muslim habits as impure. Quote, "If you're eating pork, you're unclean. If you use a knife and fork, you're dirty. If you don't eat food with your hands." Hill said that she was told to look at the floor when she was around Muslim men, because if a woman looks at a man, that means she wants to have sex with him. And this is a principle extrapolated from Surah 24:30-31, which says, "Tell the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts. That is purer for them. Surely Allah is aware of what they do. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts and not show their charms." Implying that if a woman makes eye or physical contact with an unrelated male who is not her custodian or chaperone, then that is inviting sexual contact, inviting violence upon her. This is the same mentality as burqa, niqab, or hijab. If a woman is uncovered, dressed immodestly, then she is soliciting sexual attention, according to Islamic morality. And so this is why the family members of the perpetrators justify the abuse perpetrated against white girls, because they say, well, they don't dress like Muslims, so they must have wanted it. Hill provided an extensive evidence submission for Professor Lisa Oakley's evidence to the 2022 Jay inquiry. And she said that when she was being abused, she was saturated with racial and religious slurs. She was called a white slag, a white whore, a white cunt, and told that she was a non-Muslim who deserved punishment for failing to adhere to Islamic rules. She said her abusers operated according to what she called a grooming gang ideology, under which their crimes were justified by dint of race and religion. She said, "I was told I must respect their religion. This was the first of many confusing lies that I was forced to believe. I was told that to show Muslims respect, I mustn't eat pork. I was told that Muslim girls are good and pure to stay virgins until marriage, but all white girls are slags and they sleep with hundreds of people. I was told white girls are trash, they're all whores, they're lower than the shit under your shoe. They don't obey Allah and so they deserve to be punished. They don't dress modestly. Muslim women are pure because they cover down to their ankles, down to their wrists, and the hem of their top comes down below their knees. White girls show the curves of their body, so they're asking for it. They should be raped as punishment for not obeying Allah. Kafir, non-Muslim girls, are worthless. Sex with a kafir girl doesn't count as adultery. Only sex with a Muslim woman counts as adultery. If you're not a virgin before marriage, you should be beaten. Many times I was told that the Quran says, if one of your wives disobeys you, beat her. This was often quoted to me before they beat me with their hands. They believed they had a position of religious moral superiority over non-believers. They believed it was their duty to punish us, as they believed that doing so made them good Muslims. This is what they were taught by their mothers. They were taught that witches in Pakistan are blonde, so blondes are more evil, and they deserve worse punishment. I was told that in Islam, if a woman or girl looks at a man who isn't her brother, father, or husband, that means she wants to have sex with him. So I was told to look at the floor when I was around Muslim men. So when I did look at a waiter in a restaurant, I was then taken away to be gang raped as punishment. I was told that according to their faith community, girls are old enough for sex when they start their periods aged 11. Many girls had to endure the sexual act of thighing. The Arabic for this is mufakhada, which Ella was told is a religiously sanctioned way of molesting children according to some Islamic scripture. Girls have to lie on their back with their legs straight together, and men straddle them and between their thighs. Ella was beaten, strangled, suffocated, and had her head held underwater. She was tortured, kicked, and raped over 100 times. She was told, if you don't scream when she's raped, then she's consenting to the rape, so you should be stoned to death. She was told that Muslim girls know this because the Quran says that Aisha's silence was her consent to the marriage to their Prophet Muhammad. So Muslim girls know to scream, but white girls don't, so that's their fault because they're not Muslim. When she wore a headscarf to protect herself from being raped, she was told to take it off, and then she was raped again. She knows now that these so-called ways to protect herself from being raped are rape myths used to excuse the perpetrator's criminal behaviour, much like the possession by Djinns or the Islamic dress code that Muslim men use to justify attacking white girls rather than Muslim girls. They threatened to kill Ella's parents if they tried to stop her from seeing the men. She was intimidated with guns, threatened with body parts being cut off with knives. When she tried to escape, she was told she had offended their honour, so they had to spill her blood. They did this in an honour attack. Other girls, by the way, faced the same treatment. Some had boiling water held over their heads, their tongues nailed to tables if they had threatened to talk to the police. Others had bottles, plastic bottles of boiling liquid inserted into their orifices. Just the worst kind of torture imaginable, to enforce the girls to comply with the abuse and perpetuate the conspiracy of silence, along with all of the institutions that let them down. All of the abuse that Ella experienced was linked to spiritual or religious abuse. Religious scriptures were used as tools of control to force her to conform to their will. She was not allowed to question these religious beliefs. They used their religious, moral authority and self-proclaimed elitism to control Ella through use of scripture, forced confessions, censorship of decision-making, requirement of secrecy and silence, isolation, excessive shaming and punishment around sexuality, and requiring unquestioning obedience. Ella experienced this as a deeply personal, terrifying, physical, emotional, and spiritual attack. Every time they quoted scripture, it was very hard to argue with. To them, it was like she was arguing with God. To Ella, it was actually like I was arguing with the devil. They used their so-called religious moral authority to do the most horrific, immoral acts imaginable. Others, including Sarah and Anna, were drugged, abducted in their teenage years, and subjected to similar religious abuse. She had a 12-year ordeal after being kidnapped at age 15. Sarah was repeatedly drugged with Valium, beaten, and raped. At one point, her abuser presented her with a certificate from a mosque and declared they were married according to Islamic rites. Later, he divorced her under Sharia by simply stating, "I divorce you 3 times. She was then immediately married in a ceremony conducted by an imam to a man she didn't know. Within minutes of the ceremony, the husband raped her while the wedding party continued downstairs. Over the years, Sarah was subjected to 8 forced abortions, one of them 5 months into pregnancy. Her abuser accompanied her to medical appointments, and she was forced to wear a hijab and walk 5 feet behind him. She was compelled to learn the Quran in Arabic and permitted to speak only Urdu and Punjabi. She was also made to cook and clean for the gang members who also abused her. She made several unsuccessful attempts to escape. On one occasion, after she reported her kidnapping to the police, she was interviewed by a Muslim officer who switched off the tape recorder and told her to drop her allegations of abuse because of a lack of evidence. She later learned this officer was imprisoned for offences against children too. In another case, Anna was living in a children's home in Bradford in 2002. By age 13, she was raped and abused while in the home, and at age 15, she was forced into a Sharia marriage. Her social worker attended the marriage ceremony and permitted her husband's parents to adopt her when she became pregnant. The parents received a fostering allowance from the state, so taxpayers paid for that. Anna described her situation as one of domestic slavery, in which she was treated like a maid and repeatedly abused by dozens of men. One said, before they raped me, they would chant, "Bismillah Hir Rahman Nir Rahim." The translation is, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious and the most merciful." Others arranged for the girls to be abused by Pakistani relatives who flew over to celebrate Eid. Another said, they have no compassion for the young girls that are out on the streets, and they see us as slags, as white trash. English pig dogs came up a lot. Muslims don't like pigs and they don't like dogs, so they hate pigs, and they'd put women on the same level as that. Another said, Loads of times they mentioned religion in the abuse. They used to tell me things about the good angel and the bad angel, that I've been, like, possessed, and they've got to punish me to get the badness out of me. That's why they had to rape her and do all this stuff to her to get the badness out of me, that she's got to be punished. And it's all stuff like that. They say to you, you're Gora, like white trash and white skin. It's a specific slur they have for white people. High Wycombe rape gang survivor Jade said, I get called a white slag all the time. Or they would ring me up and going, you're coming out, you white bitch. It was always, the white would always get brought up into it, yeah. But I never really, at that time, I didn't really see it as a race thing, but now, probably. In 2014, one of the Newcastle rape gang perpetrators, Badrul Hussein, was caught travelling on public transport without a ticket. The female ticket inspector claimed he shouted at her, quote, all white women are only good for one thing, for men like me to fucking use like trash. That's all women like you are worth. In the Muslim Women's Network report, they interviewed a series of young Asian and Muslim men asking them about their views on women, girls, sex and consent. They said, quote, they wear high heels, wear makeup, nice clothes, smell nice, their body language, it's the tone of their voice. We get tempted and they scream rape. They call it rape afterwards just because they feel dirty. The girls want it. They want to have sex with all the lads. They can't get enough. When their parents find out, they don't want them to know they're slags and sluts and pretend they're getting raped because they don't want to get battered. One interviewee expressed an indifference towards the gangs because the perpetrators were Pakistani and the victims were white. Quote, some people were not interested in the subject and not talking about it, especially when they think the victims are, quote, white girl, so it's almost the, quote, it doesn't interest us attitude. Despite this, the Muslim Women's Network report claimed, research shows that sexual grooming is not about race but about vulnerability, the exploitation of that vulnerability, and opportunism. One local counsellor in Rotherham blamed the girls for the abuse they'd suffered. He characterised them as willing participants who were responsible for seducing and soliciting their rapists by lying about their age and dressing immodestly by Muslim standards. Quote, the girls, the way they dress, they don't look 14 or 15 years old. The way they wear makeup, they look more adult. They go into clubs, get served in bars. It's very difficult for me, very modern dress. They have been fooled, definitely, men in the Pakistani community. The British Asians. If you have identified so many perpetrators, why have there been so little arrests? They feel British Asians have been hit by the J report. This belief that the girls were to blame and that the men were not acting in their right mind and so are not responsible for the abuse of the children is common in the Muslim community, actually. The Muslim Women's Network noted examples in their 2013 report of Pakistanis exculpating rape gang suspects of wrongdoing by saying they, the offenders, did not know what they were doing and were probably possessed by Djinn, or spirits. Nazir Afzal, the former head of the Crown Prosecution Service in the north, said, we do have an issue with people of our ethnicity, Pakistanis. It's not the issue, but an issue, and we have to take care of it. We have to deal with it. He lamented, many Muslims prefer to blame women, or even evil spirits, rather than accept that men can be responsible for terrible crimes. He was citing the murder of Kanazi Riaz and her 4 children by her husband Mohammed, who set his home and then himself on fire because his wife, quote, started to develop her own circle of friends and allowed the girls to express themselves in a more Western way. Afzal said, there are still people in that community who believe that he didn't do it. It was a haunted house. They would rather believe it was a ghost than a man that could kill women and children. You don't understand how these people think. They will not take responsibility for what they do to your children. They cannot live here. They are not compatible with our civilization. It was a mistake to bring any of them here in the first place. In 2016, the head of the Ramadan Foundation, Mohammed Shafiq, wrote in the Daily Mail after 3 of his cousins, Arshid Hussein, Bashrat Hussein, and Banaras Hussein, were jailed for participating in a Rotherham rape gang. And he explained that the Pakistani enclaves in Britain know this is going on and cover it up because they don't care about white people. They have contempt for them. Quote, the shame on my family is unspeakable, but the mortification is not merely limited to my clan. The crimes of the Hussein brothers represent a stain on the Pakistani community that can never be scrubbed away, because a small but significant minority of Pakistani men think in precisely the same warped way the Hussein brothers did, that white women are fair game, that they're entitled to satisfy their desires in whatever way they see fit. What's more, they believe it is they who are victims of a racist witch hunt, despite the fact that Pakistani gangs were allowed to rape their way around Rotherham for so long, because in part, politically correct officials were terrified of being accused of racism. And it's still happening, a decade later. How could this have happened? The root cause lies in the British Pakistani community itself. The sad truth is that for some years, some British Pakistanis have deliberately buried their heads in the sand about these predatory gangs. More than this, they see any of us who try to tackle the problem as siding with the white enemy. I have been the subject of death threats from Pakistani associates of the grooming gangs. Receiving abuse and threats on social media from anonymous Pakistani critics is a frighteningly regular occurrence. But the fact is that while I did not know what my second cousins were doing, others in our community certainly did, and yet they saw fit to sweep it under the carpet rather than helping the victims. Enough is enough. The time has come for British Pakistanis to admit we have a problem. But even after the full horror of the Hussein's crimes have been exposed, the silence from some within the Pakistani community is deafening. Part of the problem of grooming gangs is related to the tightly knit nature of the Pakistani community. It is a strongly held dictum that men should not have extramarital sex, for not only would that behaviour be quickly uncovered via the local grapevine, it would also offend their own twisted code of honour. And so these men turn to outsiders, vulnerable white girls, whom they regard as more easily available because of greater social freedom, seeing white girls as easy. But this exploitation ignores the fact that preying on white girls runs completely counter to the tenets of Muslim faith, which requires believers to treat all women with respect. Again, you can dispute his reading of the Muslim faith, as the Rape Gang Inquiry report does. Shafiq told the Yorkshire Post that until British Pakistanis accept that this is a problem for our community, we will not be able to eradicate this evil. Burying our head in the sand as the usual response is not good enough. This is not a white conspiracy dreamt up by the far right, or victimization of the Pakistani community as some claim. This is a concerted effort by a minority of Pakistani men who have groomed, abused and raped young white girls. This is a form of racism, and we shouldn't hesitate to condemn it. Blaming or deflecting attention away from the evil men who carry out such actions is despicable. Shafiq believed that actually it was the ethnic solidarity of Pakistanis, cousin marriage, Izzat, the honour and shame culture, that was perpetuating the conspiracy of silence among Pakistani enclaves in Britain. He told the BBC in 2011, there is a perception that some of these young men do not see white girls as equal, as valuable, of high moral standing, as they see their own daughters and their own sisters, and I think that's wrong. It's a form of racism that's abhorrent in a civilised society. And that's why, in 2025, Katie Lamb MP, when she read from a transcript of one of the grooming gang trials, found that a Pakistani perpetrator had told their victims that, quote, we're here to fuck white girls and fuck the government. One survivor was asked whether or not she thinks the imams are aware, and she said, they know 100%, because my friend was, when she was 15, was sleeping with a guy who was older. She had a baby by him, and his dad was an imam. His dad knew, and he got his son married and said that he wasn't allowed to see the child. They look after their own community. Some white women are even conscripted into the gangs through abuse, conversion, forced marriage. One survivor said, I heard lots of stories from Western women where their children had been kidnapped and they'd never see them again. Western women that had been married, gone to the Middle East, their children had been taken. One victim said of the family members, she was sat behind us, directly behind us in the public gallery. Throughout the whole sentencing, she was constantly saying, fucking liars, lying white bitches. She was a white woman herself, who I imagine may have been groomed and had obviously now married into the family, shouting obscenities at us. She said to me that God will be the witness for what happens to me. One survivor's mother, called Victoria, detailed in the inquiry how her daughter was groomed, abused, and then slowly converted to Islam to try to pry her away from her mother. In 2023, her daughter abruptly converted to Islam. Victoria discovered Muslim clothing, a Quran, and a prayer mat hidden under her bed. Her daughter began quoting the Quran and praying 5 times a day. This sudden change coincided with a secret relationship with an Algerian Muslim student who held strong Islamic beliefs. She became disrespectful to her family and started speaking negatively about Britain. Her daughter's diet changed dramatically. She stopped eating bacon and ate far less than before. She spent a lot of time in and out of hospital but never explained why to her mother. Her mental health had deteriorated severely. After meeting the man, she repeatedly attempted suicide by cutting and made desperate calls saying she would kill herself. During one emergency hospital stay, police removed her daughter from Victoria, threatened Victoria with arrest, and transported the girl to the address of her abuser's brother, despite Victoria's explicit warnings about the danger. So the police are complicit into handing these girls over to the perpetrators. While there, her daughter was subjected to mental and physical abuse, including strangulation, death threats, rape, and financial exploitation. Money was funneled through her abuser's brother's bank account. The man and his family racially abused her, calling her a white slag, and pressured her to drop all complaints and marry him. Prevent was involved, but it was catastrophically delayed. The college's safeguarding lead initially told Victoria that referrals had been made and accepted, but later evidence showed they were sent late, incorrectly, or not at all. Arrests were delayed for months, and rape allegations were eventually dropped due to a lack of evidence after only limited phone checks. Victoria concluded that systemic failure and institutional reluctance to address Islamic-related safeguarding had placed her daughter in grave danger. Despite all of this, the inquiry notes that sentencing guidance does not account for racial or religious abuse being an aggravating factor in such cases against white people. They note, the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998 and Sentencing Council guidance explicitly permit, in cases of demonstrated hostility, require an uplift in the imposed sentence where an offence is aggravated by racial or religious hostility. Evidence in grooming gang trials has repeatedly shown precisely this: victims described as white slags, white trash, kafar bitches, or told they were only good for men like me to fuck and use like trash. Perpetrators shouted Allahu Akbar even when sentenced, and boasted of racial supremacy. But as far as available public records are concerned, racial aggravations have never once been invoked against anti-white rape gangs, either by prosecutors or judges. This is in stark contrast to what tends to happen whenever white criminals are held to account for interracial crimes, like the rape of a Sikh woman that happened recently. Prosecutors did not hesitate, for instance, to pursue aggravating charges against Darren Osborne after he murdered a crowd of Muslims with his van at Finsbury Park Mosque in 2017, sentencing Osborne to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 43 years. The judge cited Schedule 21 to the Criminal Justice Act 2003 to confirm that a murder done for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause counted alongside a terrorist connection as an aggravating factor in Osborne's crimes. But instead, sentences in rape gang cases have remained at the lower end of the scale, often 4 to 12 years, for men convicted of raping dozens of children over years, rather than the life sentences or 20-year tariffs the offending merited. I would actually argue the death penalty. The perfect example of this is the one that we began with, Shabir Ahmed, who was let out of his sentence early, despite being the ringleader of a rape gang that raped hundreds of girls in Rochdale for decades. As the Quilliam Foundation's analysis of convictions between 2005-17, that I read the demographic perpetrator stats out from earlier, they found the overwhelming majority of perpetrators received terms that bore no relation to the lifetime harm inflicted. Even in high-profile cases such as Rotherham and Rochdale, ringleaders received effective tariffs that allowed release after serving less than half their sentence. This leniency persisted despite the organised, predatory, and repeated nature of the crimes, and it's still going on today. And the reason is, the British state is institutionally anti-white. It is concerned only with policing the negative opinions that white Brits have of Muslims as a result of terror attacks and rape gangs, and so they just don't care. The purpose of the system is what it does, and the purpose of the British state is to put your children in danger so that they can call themselves authentically anti-racist. However, not all of these testimonies are equal, and this is a very uncomfortable conversation to have, but as Adam Wren pointed out in his article, there are some details in some of these accounts, one in particular, with the pseudonym Kate, which strain credulity, because either this person is the most unfortunate human being to have ever lived, or some of these claims are embellished. And I will summarize them, and I think it's worth addressing the fact that some embellishments may have made it into the report, so that down the line the entire report is not attempted to be discredited. And yet again we face another news cycle of trying to dismiss and deny and downplay the very real scandal of the Pakistani rape gangs as some form of satanic panic. Kate's story is that she claims to have been abused by her father and brother until being placed in foster care aged 5. She didn't remember this until she was 12 years old and had sex education at school, and this brought up a repressed memory for her that she found traumatic. She was then assaulted by 3 drunk men after leaving her foster home late at night when she was 12, when she left the foster home to commit suicide. The men filmed the abuse and used it to blackmail her into being prostituted. After she told her counsellors and foster parents, she then went to police. For an extended period of time, both officers repeatedly told her how much trouble she would be in if any detail of her statement was disproved, and that she could withdraw the allegation before the interview started with no further consequences. They also suggested that her parents would be relieved if she said the incident had not happened. This was despite her returning home in blood-stained clothes and, during the walk home, having slept on the doorstep of her family's church, and while she was walking, both a van and a taxi driver stopped to ask if she was okay and offer her a lift home. So presumably there would be witnesses to this, there would be articles of clothing, there would perhaps be a record of the police interaction. Some weeks later, her foster parents discovered sexually explicit messages in her phone between Kate and adult men, including photographs. They were reported to the police, but it was concluded that Kate was engaging with these men consensually, despite being just 13 years old, which, again, is an appalling failure by the police in this circumstance. She then recanted her story and attempted suicide again. She then alleges that she was instructed by the abusers who had filmed and blackmailed her to come to a house in the town centre. She was taken inside, all abusers were present, they abused her again, making clear this time she was being filmed. They then told her she worked for them and was expected to do what they told, otherwise the footage would be leaked. They then said that they would be abusing her on a live stream, on a webcam, and if the webcam didn't generate the amount of money they expected, Kate would be punished, brutalized. She also alleges that over the following year, after the police report that went nowhere, she went missing on numerous occasions, including during school hours and late at night. She alleges that no record was made of her abuse, but that the gang was blackmailing her into what they called jobs, so abuse by gang members and their associates for which they received payment. They include webcamming, gang rape, parties, cop nights, where the police would show up and abuse the girls, and red rooms, so rooms of sadomasochistic abuse. She was claiming to be abused multiple times a week, up to 2 to 4 times a day, and she said she encountered another girl that the gang was exploiting, and that the girl was younger than her. When they met, Kate had been instructed to meet 2 of the gang members in a secluded location late at night. They were holding the girl tightly around the neck, and Kate was told that they were breaking the girl in that night. She went on to work with this girl on multiple occasions, saying that they became very close. At age 16, she alleges to have been trafficked by the gang and was raped on a canal boat by a police officer. She escaped, and her hands were bound, and she was given shelter by a woman who called the police. Officers told her not to remove the rope bindings from Kate's wrists, as they could be used as evidence, but because Kate didn't disclose her rapist was a police officer, the complaint was not taken forward, despite, again, the physical evidence at the scene. She then says that during this period, she was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. The following sentence then says that Kate alleges she was then abused in a hotel by a man that she believes was a doctor. I think, unfortunately, this DID diagnosis may be essential to understanding the series of unfortunate events that have been alleged by this woman. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that she has suffered a severe form of abuse, and that has onset DID. But I haven't even gotten through half of the atrocities that she claims to have suffered at the hands of a random gang of rapist vagrants and other gang members who have monetized the abuse on webcams, rented her out to police officers, and had red rooms where women were tortured. Meanwhile, the police, despite having proof of this, have not taken any of this forward. Again, it is entirely possible that some, even all of this so far has happened because of how the police have handled previous instances of abuse, but it does get more difficult to take at face value as we go on. At this point, both Kate's family and the professionals involved in her care began to express frustration with what they perceived to be her lifestyle choices. They didn't believe she was being exploited and instead assumed that she, still 16, was willingly meeting adult men. Again, no child is responsible for their own abuse. So, regardless of how difficult some of the details in this story coming up are to believe, no matter what happened to this woman, when she was a child, she was not to blame. She then alleges that the young girl that she had met previously was killed in front of her. After a meeting at the school where she said that she was being abused, the gang said that they were aware of every time she'd spoken to the police. They had people on the inside. They accused her of snitching, saying that she would pay for it. Shortly afterwards, she was taken to a remote wooded location. The young girl Kate had met before was also present. Initially, Kate believed that they had been taken there for another job. The men then subjected the girl to extreme sexual and physical violence while Kate was forcibly restrained and made to witness what had happened. Kate alleges the girl was then murdered in front of her, to send a message to not talk to the police again. She was then placed in Edge of Care services at 18, where she says she was abused in the care home. Only then did the police take her claim seriously, and she was sectioned. Shortly afterwards, she was abused by the same gang again, who said they knew she had spoken to the police. She was removed from the college and taken to a red room setting, another torture dungeon. Another girl, Meg, was also present. During the incident, Kate alleges she was forced to witness extreme violence that resulted in Meg losing her life. So this would be the second girl that she alleges she saw killed. As far as we know, as members of the public, because obviously this is still pseudonymous and this could be forthcoming, details about these girls' identities and the 2 open murder cases have not been presented as part of this inquiry. Perhaps the police are following up on them as we speak. If they are true, we have to hope so. But again, this seems to be one of the most unfortunate series of events that could befall a single person by random chance. Before Kate was due to start university, she reports she was taken to London during the Notting Hill Carnival and made to engage in street-based sex work. At one point, Kate found the nearest police officers and attempted to explain that she wasn't safe, that she'd been trafficked, and that she was worried her abuser would find her. They confirmed she had been reported as a missing person and contacted Kate's father, who told the officers she was lying and refused to come and collect her. Again, it is possible that she is persistently disbelieved, but if everyone in her orbit is saying they don't believe these increasingly outlandish claims of torture rooms, multiple murder, rape and abduction by random vagrants that she happened to encounter while walking through the street after trying to commit suicide as a teenager, it seems to be a pattern of disbelief in her life by everyone around her as the claims get increasingly extreme. And it's important that non-credible claims don't contaminate an otherwise valid and important report, because one of the headline claims was bestial abuse of girls by dogs, and this was produced in a standalone letter published by the Inquiry on the website, something that gained international attention. Elon Musk amplified it, was horrified by it. But when you find out that the claim originates from Kate's story specifically, it gets a bit uncomfortable to question, but difficult to believe. I don't hope I'm wrong, because I hope nobody has ever endured this, but at the same time, for the sake of the integrity of the inquiry, I hope all of this is truthful, and I hope that all of the perpetrators are brought to justice. However, on one occasion, Kate was taken by her abusers from an area close to the university. They told her she was in trouble because she hadn't been available for jobs due to a recent hospital admission. She was transported to a remote location and held in a caravan for approximately 9 days. During this period, she reports she was subjected to repeated sexual violence, severe physical assaults, and sustained torture, including being raped by a dog as the men placed bets on whether it would penetrate her vagina or anus, filmed and forced to watch the footage. This was the most extreme and prolonged incident she had experienced and represented a significant escalation in the level of harm and control being exerted over her. If this claim were made by a victim on its own or in conjunction with a series of other credible claims, we could take it very, very seriously. But because it's embedded in this story of disbelief, dissociative identity disorder, diagnosis and sectioning, repeated police reports with substantial evidence that aren't believed, abuse by random gangs of vagrants, and now abuse by animals, it seems like either the most horrible life lived by one person on Earth, or that some of these claims are exaggerated. And if they aren't accurate, then more scrutiny should have been applied to ensure that non-credible claims don't contaminate the report, because critics that are looking for an excuse to dismiss it will seize upon them to try to deny the gangs are happening and to try to paralyze our country against acting to keep girls safe. And this has been the disgraceful reaction. Not only has there been a total media blackout, save Joe Rogan, Patrick Christys, Sky News Australia, and a few podcasts, streamers like Asmund Gold and Nick Fuentes, the only politicians that seem to have reacted to this are either the inquiry debate on child exploitation that I covered previously on this channel, that I'll link down in the description, where Muslim MPs like Ayub Khan or Labour MPs sought to deflect or deny the scandal. But also, Muslim Labour MP, Pakistani man Afzal Khan, reported Rupert Lowe to the parliamentary authorities for his criticism of Sharia courts, the burqa and halal slaughter, and his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience to discuss the rape gang inquiry. He claims Rupert is trying to scapegoat Muslims and sow division in society. I happen to think that Pakistani rape gangs cause the division, and there is no original position where we would be unified with people who do such horrible things to our children if only Rupert Lowe hadn't have produced this report and spoke about it on Joe Rogan. He said, appearing on Rogan's podcast itself is extremely problematic. Lowe said he will be abundantly clear, he won't be apologising, he won't be silenced, and that his views are shared by a large majority of the British people. He wrote a letter in response to Khan saying, "Thank you for taking the time to report me to the parliamentary authorities over my criticisms of Sharia courts, the burqa and halal slaughter. Not just that, but you also included our independent inquiry into the Muslim rape gangs and my appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, which you deemed to be extremely problematic. Carefully devising and formulating your complaint was clearly time well spent for a politician representing such a neglected part of Greater Manchester, where the grooming gangs are operating. The multiple footnotes referencing Joe's podcast, the most watched on the planet, were particularly entertaining, very helpful, thank you. But joking aside, I want to be really clear in my response to your various complaints. These barbaric, medieval, backward Islamic practices have no place in our country. When Restore Britain gains power, they'll be banned on day one. It will be glorious. I also encourage Reform UK to take up similar policies. On your criticism of our rape gang inquiry, I respectfully invite you to have a meeting with Sammy Woodhouse, a survivor who was raped by Pakistani men and has been leading our inquiry. An upstanding woman who has done a lot for victims and who I had the honour of corresponding with during my contributions to the inquiry. She says she's very keen to discuss their findings with Mr. Khan. In short, the findings were that mass industrial rape of vulnerable white girls has occurred right across Britain by gangs of Muslim men, including in Greater Manchester, where the Labour Party and Andy Burnham, the next Prime Minister, has failed so spectacularly. Rupert attached a copy of the inquiry report and also the mass deportation plan for dealing with the problem. The report makes a series of recommendations. On page 10, it says, following the publication of this report, we intend to release the full witness testimonies, gather additional survivor accounts, identify those responsible in Parliament, and begin civil and private legal actions to ensure maximum accountability. So they'll pursue private prosecutions with the funds that are still available as a result of crowdfunding this inquiry and weren't spent on actually holding the hearings and writing and editing the inquiry. And also I presume that the video testimonies, those that are eligible to be released, will be released in the future. So if I do get the video footage of my testimony, I'll post it in full on YouTube and Substack. There's an extensive section on recommendations going forward based on the findings of the inquiry. It says the Sentencing Council must be required by statute to revise its guidelines so that group-based child exploitation carries a starting point of life imprisonment, with a minimum tariff of 50 years for ringleaders and 25 for participants. Rupert Lowe wants the death penalty for these perpetrators. So do I. So it seems to the likes of Richard Tice and Lee Anderson in Reform UK. I wouldn't be shocked if Zia Youssef wouldn't like to serve as executioner himself. I think there should be a cross-party proposition to reinstate the death penalty for the rape gangs. Solves the problem of not being able to deport some of them as well, doesn't it? On deportations, the report is clear. Every foreign national convicted of group-based child exploitation must at the very least be deported. Any British citizen convicted of these offences who holds dual nationality must lose their citizenship automatically upon conviction, rendering them liable for deportation. This ought to apply retrospectively to those convicted in the past. 2. The Home Office must publish annual deportation figures broken down by national background and offence type. Where a perpetrator has family members in Britain who have supported, harboured or failed to report the offending, the entire family unit must also face deportation proceedings themselves, unless they can prove either active cooperation with authorities or no prior knowledge. As we've read from previous insights from members of the Pakistani community, or just quotes from the complicit family members themselves, they know they don't care, they're covering it up, and so they have to go. The evidence from witnesses, convictions, and the Casey audit shows a clear overrepresentation of Muslim men, particularly of Pakistani heritage, in these organised networks. The inquiry has not ignored this. Mosques, madrasas, and community organisations that have harboured or failed to report perpetrators must face investigation and, if found guilty, be closed. The immediate deportation of anyone nested within subcultures promoting attitudes that dehumanise non-Muslim girls must be pursued. That will lead to the effective denaturalisation of the majority of Pakistanis and other Muslims in Britain. And I support this. The nations of the world are not identical. Ultra-selective border control, attentive to general patterns in sending countries, is therefore also vital to the long-run happiness and continued existence of host peoples across the West. Immigration policy must immediately reflect the evidence. Anyone from a country whose nationals are disproportionately represented in rape gang convictions must no longer be entitled to a visa. This should be applied ruthlessly. Our young girls must come first. And we have the data on who these people are. As I included in my submission to the inquiry, the UK was first in Western Europe and second on the continent as a whole for crimes committed by foreign nationals in 2023. In 2023, foreign nationals were arrested 34% more than British nationals, 1 in 70 foreign nationals compared to 1 in 94 British nationals. However, a Telegraph analysis of police data puts the number up to twice the rate, averaging 22.2 arrests per 1,000 foreign nationals compared to 10.3 per 1,000 British nationals. And that's, again, by passport holder, not ethnic breakdown. It's even more severe when you break it down by white British versus foreign extraction. Foreign nationals were arrested 3.5 times more for sex offences than British nationals in 2024, 165 arrests per 100,000 for foreign nationals, compared to 48 per 100,000 for British nationals. Foreign nationals from Muslim-majority countries, including Albania, Afghanistan, Somalia, Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Eritrea, Tunisia, Libya, and Iran, are vastly overrepresented among convicted criminals in the UK. Foreign nationals are responsible for up to a third of annual sex crimes, with males from Afghanistan and Eritrea 20 times more likely to be convicted of a sex crime per capita than British men. Foreign nationals are 27% more likely to be imprisoned than British nationals. As of June 2023, the UK had at least 10,321 foreign nationals in prison in England and Wales. Among the nationalities with the highest incarceration rates were Albanian, Kosovan, Vietnamese, Algerian, Jamaican, Eritrean, Iraqi, Somalian, Guinean, Sudanese, Iranian, and Afghani. 1 in 50 Albanians in the UK is in prison. A quarter, 3,235, of all foreign criminals released from prison go on to re-offend each year. They just don't need to be here. Those crimes never needed to happen. Between April 2018 and March 2022, foreign nationals committed 38,868 re-offences, including 555 sex offences, 11,852 thefts, and 4,418 assaults. Britain has seen a 60% rise in honour-based violence between 2022 and 2024, and a 193% rise since 2016. It's also seen a 75% rise in acid attacks between 2022 and 2023, and it has the most recorded in any country in the world, but that's just because we actually bothered to record it, unlike the Muslim nations where it is common, and from which it has been exported to us. And this corresponds with the data from other countries in Europe. In Denmark, immigrants from the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, Pakistan, and Turkey, and their descendants, commit 2.5 times the violent crime of native Danes, and despite making up only 13% of the population, commit 25% of violent crime, and comprise almost 50% of the prison population. In Norway, men of African Islamic origin were twice as likely to have a criminal record as Norwegians, with rates of violent crime and rates of registered criminal involvement among refugees even higher. In Finland, immigrants from Iraq and Somalia are 6 to 7 times more likely to commit violent crimes and larceny than the Finnish-born population. And in Germany, foreign nationals are 15% of the population, but committed 41% of crimes in 2023. We could just rid ourselves of these problems by closing our borders and sending these people home. The report also says the Crown Prosecution Service must create a dedicated national unit for group-based child exploitation, with specialist prosecutors trained in trauma-informed practice. Charging decisions must no longer be influenced by community impact or fear of racism allegations. Failing to charge a clear case must be reviewable by the Attorney General and should result in a criminal liability for those who do not carry out their duty. Pursuant to achieving those goals, the Equality Act 2010 should be repealed altogether and never applied in criminal justice and safeguarding contexts. Anti-discrimination principles must not operate as a deterrent to the identification of risk patterns or the enforcement of criminal law. And of course, mandatory ethnicity data should be recorded for both victims and perpetrators to build an accurate demographic pattern of offences. They also recommend the passage of a Childhood Exploitation Act, which states in law that children can never consent. The Act must prohibit any agency or court from treating a child's previous behaviour, clothing, intoxication, or lifestyle choices as mitigation or consent. Any professional who uses such language in reports or proceedings will face disciplinary action and potential criminal sanction. It would also prohibit unlicensed Sharia marriages and ensure that proven rapists will forfeit their parental rights so they have no visitation or access to children conceived via rape. It would also expunge convictions for children who were charged with crimes by police officers while being groomed and raped, because they were treated as the criminals rather than their abusers. It recommends the police implement a multi-agency coordination approach on CSE and a uniform operational framework, and they would seek to impose a statutory obligation on the NHS and its sexual health clinics, GP surgeries, A&E departments, and mental health service providers to trigger an automatic safeguarding referral for any child presenting with STIs, genital injuries, pregnancies, or repeated self-harm linked to exploitation. Because there were a number of instances in the report of girls that would show up to a hospital, even accompanied by their abusers, reporting injuries from sexual abuse, and be given some disinfectants and birth control pills and sent on their way. These recommendations sound banal, but it should highlight how insane it is that they aren't enforced already, and how complicit the state is at every level in this scandal. Rupert Lowe has already said that he plans to use parliamentary privilege to name perpetrators and their enablers in the chamber if there is no possibility of procuring a private prosecution for them. It will be done incredibly carefully with the legal team involved every step of the way to ensure that no future prosecutions are jeopardised. He says that they are cooperating with the authorities in order to help cases be opened and reopened, but that his faith in the system to independently deliver justice is not high. That's why he plans to pursue private prosecutions and civil litigation. A target list has been identified, it continues to grow. This all has to be handled very carefully for obvious reasons, but he's determined to act. He's had enough talk, and his aim is straightforward. Put people in prison, deliver justice. We will act, not talk. Again, the action remains to be seen. We must give the inquiry some grace and time to deliver on its promises. I just hope that we actually get some accountability from this, in lieu of a national statutory inquiry which has been promised as a result of pressure brought by the independent, privately funded inquiry by Reform UK should they take government. But this is symptomatic of the state's response to not just the inquiry, but the scandal writ large. This is symptomatic of the approach taken by the Labour government to the forthcoming localised statutory inquiries. They don't want to address the problem. They don't want to admit what has been done to generations of British women and girls. They don't want to admit that these perpetrators never needed to be here in the first place. They don't want to admit that this is the single worst atrocity perpetrated on the British people. Because the implications are the expulsion of the perpetrators and the communities that generate them, the prescription of practices by which these gangs live, the disestablishment of mosques in which this ideology that perpetuated and justified the abuse was preached. They don't want to admit that the entire multicultural, multi-ethnic experiment in Britain has failed. They don't want to rewind 70 years of governance following the Second World War. But that's what's necessary. The only way to deal with this problem is to ensure that we just stop importing and start deporting the perpetrators and the communities which reliably produce them. That we stop treating children as responsible for their own abuse. That never again are these atrocities perpetrated on British soil. And that can only be done by a government willing to put the British people first. And after reading these horrors and all the new acts of violence that enter the headlines every day, I think the public appetite is there to vote for one. It just depends on who is willing to confront this problem and put forward a comprehensive policy prospectus to ensure that our door is never darkened by such evils in the future.